Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Pedals Rebellion, from Jake Morrison. The interstate stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon under the October moon, and my Kenworth's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I made my way through the Nevada desert. I'd been driving for Morrison Freight for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment across the country's endless highways. Tonight's cargo was simple enough, a load of office supplies bound for Sacramento. But something felt different about this run from the moment I'd fired up the engine back in Reno. The trouble started subtle, the way these things always do. I was cruising at a steady 70 when I felt it, just a slight tremor in the brake pedal beneath my right boot. Nothing alarming, mind you, just a faint vibration that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, separate from the truck's natural rumble. I'd felt worn brake pads before, experienced the grinding metal and the spongy give that meant maintenance was overdue. But this was something else entirely. The pedal felt almost alive under my foot, like it was trying to communicate something I couldn't quite understand. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, their voices drifting in and out of static as they shared updates about way stations and speed traps ahead. Breaker 19, this is Desert Fox westbound at mile marker 42. Anybody got their ears on about that construction zone near Sparks? The familiar comfort of trucker talk helped ease my mind as I reached down to adjust the air conditioning. The desert night was surprisingly warm for October, and a thin sheen of sweat had begun to form on my forehead despite the cool air blowing from the vents. As the miles rolled by, that strange tremor in the brake pedal grew more pronounced. What had started as a barely perceptible flutter now felt like deliberate movement, as if something beneath the floorboard was trying to push the pedal away from my foot. I pressed down experimentally, testing the brake's response, and felt a peculiar resistance, not mechanical failure, but something that reminded me of pressing against a living thing that didn't want to be pressed. The truck slowed normally enough, but I could swear I felt the pedal trying to spring back up with more force than simple hydraulic pressure should allow. Mile marker 67 slipped past in the darkness, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The desert landscape on either side of the highway was nothing but shadow and suggestion, broken only by the occasional distant light from some lonely ranch or gas station. My headlights carved a cone of visibility through the night, illuminating the white lines that seemed to pulse hypnotically as they disappeared under my front bumper. The engine's steady drone had taken on an almost musical quality, harmonizing with whatever force was causing that increasingly insistent tremor in the brake pedal. I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Maybe it was a problem with the air brake system, some kind of pressure buildup that was causing unusual feedback through the pedal. Lord knows I'd seen stranger mechanical issues in my years on the road. There was that time outside Bakersfield when my trailer's electrical system started playing the radio through the turn signals, and the incident near Phoenix when a loose heat shield made sounds like someone tapping Morse code on the fuel tank. Trucks were complex machines with thousands of components, and sometimes they developed quirks that defied easy explanation. But this felt different. This felt intentional. As I crested a small rise in the highway, the lights of a truck stop appeared about 2 miles ahead, a welcome sight of civilization in the vast emptiness. I began to ease off the accelerator, preparing to downshift and coast toward the exit ramp when the brake pedal gave a violent jerk beneath my foot. Not the gradual push I'd been feeling, but a sudden, forceful movement that nearly knocked my boot away entirely. I pressed down harder, trying to maintain contact, but the pedal seemed to be fighting me with a strength that grew more determined with each passing second. My heart rate quickened as I realized I was no longer in complete control of my stopping power. The truck stop was getting closer, and I needed to begin braking soon if I wanted to make the exit safely with a full load behind me. I pressed down on the pedal with deliberate force, feeling whatever was causing the resistance push back with equal determination. It was like arm wrestling with something invisible, something that had its own agenda about when and how I should be allowed to stop my truck. The CB radio suddenly erupted with static, then fell silent. The only sounds were the engine's rumble, the whisper of tires on asphalt, and my own increasingly rapid breathing. I could feel sweat beading on my palms as I maintained pressure on the rebellious brake pedal, fighting to keep my foot in position, while simultaneously trying to steer toward the truck stop's off-ramp. The familiar amber glow of the parking lot's sodium lights had never looked more inviting. Then, without warning, the pedal gave way completely. Not the gradual release of hydraulic pressure I expected, but a sudden absence of resistance that sent my foot stomping down to the floorboard with enough force to jar my entire leg. But instead of the truck lurching to a halt as it should have with such aggressive braking, nothing happened. The Kenworth continued rolling at highway speed as if I hadn't touched the brakes at all. I pumped the pedal frantically, feeling it move freely up and down without any of the firm resistance that should indicate proper brake engagement. Panic began to creep up my spine as the truck stop exit approached rapidly. I was coming in too fast and too hot to make the turn safely, especially with 20 tons of cargo pushing me from behind. I grabbed for the parking brake lever, yanking it with enough force to strain my shoulder, but again felt no response from the truck's momentum. Whatever was happening to my braking system had apparently affected all of it. Service brakes, parking brake, even the engine brake seemed to have no effect when I flipped the switch. But then, just as I was preparing to radio for emergency assistance and start looking for a safe place to hopefully coast to a stop, the brake pedal began moving on its own. I watched in fascination and terror as it slowly depressed itself, without any pressure from my foot, as if controlled by an invisible driver who had finally decided it was time to slow down. The truck's speed began to decrease with smooth precision, the kind of gradual, controlled deceleration that spoke of expert handling. By the time I reached the truck stop's entrance, my speed had dropped to a perfect 15 miles per hour for the turn. I guided the Kenworth through the parking lot on trembling legs, still not trusting that my brakes were truly responding normally again. The truck stop was mostly empty except for a few other semis parked in the back rows and a handful of cars near the main building. I found a spot under one of the tall floodlights and attempted to bring the truck to a complete stop, holding my breath as I pressed down on the brake pedal. This time it responded normally, with the proper resistance and immediate effect I'd expected all along. After setting the parking brake and shutting down the engine, I sat in the sudden silence trying to process what had just happened. The logical part of my mind was already working to construct rational explanations. Maybe there had been air in the brake lines that worked itself out, or perhaps some kind of electronic glitch in the truck's computer systems that had corrected itself. Modern trucks were full of sensors and automated systems that could malfunction in ways that seemed almost supernatural to drivers from my generation. I climbed down from the cab and walked around to inspect the brake components I could see, looking for any obvious signs of mechanical failure or tampering. Everything appeared normal, brake lines intact, no leaking fluid, no unusual wear or damage. The truck looked exactly like it should, which somehow made the experience feel even more unsettling. At least visible problems could be fixed by competent mechanics. Inside the truck stop, I bought coffee and tried to strike up conversation with other drivers, hoping someone might have experienced something similar. But how do you casually ask if anyone's brake pedal has ever seemed to develop a mind of its own? The few drivers I talked to were tired and focused on their own runs, eager to grab fuel and food and get back on the road. I found myself describing my experience as weird brake problems and leaving it at that. An hour later, I was back on Interstate 80 heading west toward Sacramento with renewed caution, For the first 50 miles, the brake pedal behaved perfectly, responding exactly as it should every time I tested it. I began to relax, convincing myself that whatever had happened was a one-time mechanical anomaly that had resolved itself. The desert night was peaceful again, with the familiar rhythm of the road helping to restore my confidence. But as I approached the California state line, I felt it again, that subtle tremor, that sense of something alive and willful pressing back against my foot. This time, though, it felt different. Not resistant or rebellious, but almost protective. As if whatever force controlled the pedal had decided I could be trusted, that we could work together rather than fight each other. The Convoy of Silent Horns, from Marcus Chen. The thing about driving long haul is that you develop rituals, little habits that keep you sane during those endless stretches of asphalt and horizon. Mine was always the CB radio, Channel 19. Listening to the chatter of other drivers cutting through the loneliness of the interstate like a warm knife through cold butter. Truckers have their own language, their own brotherhood. And when you're pushing a 40-ton rig through the small hours of the morning with nothing but coffee and willpower keeping you upright, those voices become your lifeline to the world. That's why the silence felt so wrong when it started on that October night somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City. I'd been running this route for 6 years, hauling electronics from California to distribution centers back east, and I knew the rhythm of the road like a familiar song. By 2 a.m, the chatter usually died down to a comfortable murmur, occasional check-ins about speed traps or weather conditions, but it never went completely quiet. Never like this. My Peterbilt 389 hummed along Interstate 40 with that steady diesel purr that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. The cab was bathed in the soft green glow of the dashboard lights, and outside the Texas panhandle stretched away into darkness so complete, it seemed to swallow my headlight beams after just a few hundred yards. The weather was clear, no wind to speak of, just that vast emptiness that makes you feel like you're the only person left alive on Earth. I reached for the CB handset, clicked the button and spoke into the familiar ritual. Breaker 19. This is Night Owl eastbound at mile marker 212. Looking for a radio check. I released the button and waited for the usual response. Someone calling back with their handle and position. Maybe a joke or comment about the late hour. Instead, I got nothing but the soft hiss of static. Maybe my radio was acting up. These older CBs could be finicky, especially with the temperature changes. I tried again, this time broadcasting on channel 21, then 17, cycling through the common frequencies. Nothing but that empty static, like the sound of wind through a graveyard. I tapped the microphone against my palm, checked the connections, even gave the radio a gentle thump that had worked before. The green display showed it was functioning normally, receiving and transmitting, but the airwaves felt dead as roadkill. That's when I noticed the lights in my mirrors. At first, it was just a single set of headlights maybe half a mile back, nothing unusual in itself. But as the minutes passed and the lights neither gained nor lost distance, staying in that exact same position like they were tethered to my trailer, I started paying closer attention. The headlights had that distinctive bright white glow of modern LEDs. Probably another big rig running the same route. I tried the CB again, directing my call specifically to whoever was behind me. Driver in the white lights about half a mile back. This is the Pete with the black trailer, you copy? Static answered me, that same empty hiss. The lights continued their steady pursuit, matching my speed exactly. When I accelerated slightly to test them, they accelerated. When I eased off the throttle, they slowed with me, maintaining that precise distance like we were connected by invisible wire. More lights appeared over the next hour, emerging from on-ramps and side roads with an almost choreographed precision. 2 more sets from a truck stop near Shamrock, another 3 that materialized from what looked like an abandoned rest area, their headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of nocturnal predators. By 3:30 in the morning, I counted 11 sets of lights strung out behind me in a perfect convoy, all maintaining exact positions, all moving with that same eerie synchronization. I tried every CB channel, tried calling out on the emergency frequency, even attempted to raise a local repeater on my ham radio. The silence was absolute. Not even the usual background chatter from distant stations or the occasional burst of skip from Mexico or Canada. It was as if some invisible hand had reached down and severed all radio communication across the entire Great Plains, leaving just me and my followers moving through the darkness like ghosts. The real fear started creeping in when I began to notice details about the other trucks. In my side mirrors, I could make out their shapes when they passed under the infrequent overhead lights, and something was fundamentally wrong with what I was seeing. The trucks looked normal enough, a mix of makes and models you'd expect on any interstate, but their running lights were all wrong. Every truck had their marker lights illuminated. Those required amber and red lights that helped define a vehicle's size and position, but they were too bright, too perfectly aligned, giving each truck an almost ethereal glow against the black landscape. More disturbing was what I wasn't seeing. No exhaust smoke was visible from any of the trucks, even in the cool night air, that should have made diesel exhaust clearly visible in their headlight beams. No variation in following distance despite differences in truck models and presumed loads. No signs of drivers making the small adjustments and corrections that human beings naturally make when controlling 40-ton vehicles at highway speeds. They moved with mechanical precision that no human driver could maintain for more than a few minutes. I decided to test them. Taking my foot off the accelerator, I let the big Peterbilt speed drop from 75 to 60 miles per hour, expecting the convoy behind me to eventually pass or at least bunch up as faster trucks caught up with slower ones. Instead, they all decelerated in perfect unison, maintaining their exact spacing and formation as if controlled by a single mind. When I accelerated back to highway speed, they matched me instantly. No hesitation, no variance. My hands were starting to shake on the steering wheel. Whatever was behind me, those weren't normal trucks with normal drivers. I considered pulling off at the next exit, letting the convoy pass so I could see them more clearly. Maybe figure out what kind of elaborate prank or convoy this might be. But as I approached the exit for McLean, something made me keep going. Some instinct told me that stopping would be a very bad idea, that whatever game was being played on this stretch of interstate, the rules didn't include timeouts or safe zones. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, making me jump so hard I nearly jerked the wheel. But instead of a voice, what came through the speakers was a low rhythmic sound like breathing, or maybe like the synchronized idling of multiple diesel engines. The sound pulsed through the cab, seeming to match the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I reached for the volume control to turn it down, but the sound continued at the same level no matter where I set the dial. It was coming through the radio but somehow bypassing the normal controls, filling the cab with that mechanical breathing. In my mirrors, I could see that the convoy had closed ranks. What had been 11 separate trucks spread over a mile of highway had compressed into a tight formation maybe 300 yards behind me. Their headlights had merged into a wall of white light that filled my mirrors and cast strange shadows across the interior of my cab. The marker lights I'd noticed earlier were pulsing now, all in perfect synchronization, creating a hypnotic pattern of amber and red that seemed designed to draw my attention away from the road ahead. I forced myself to look forward, and immediately wished I hadn't. About 2 miles ahead, I could see more lights waiting on the shoulder, a line of trucks that stretched into the darkness. As I approached, they began pulling onto the highway in front of me, not with the gradual acceleration of normal traffic, but with that same mechanical precision I'd observed in the trucks behind me. Their headlights swung across the pavement as they merged, and I caught glimpses of their profiles against the stars. The trucks were identical. Every single one was the same make, model, and apparent year. differing only in color schemes that looked faded and wrong in the artificial light. More disturbing, their windows were dark. Not just tinted, but completely black, as if there was nothing behind the glass but empty space. No glow from dashboard lights, no silhouette of a driver. No indication that anyone or anything was controlling these massive vehicles as they formed up ahead of me. I was boxed in now, trapped in the middle of a convoy that stretched beyond my vision in both directions. The synchronized breathing from the CB had grown louder, and I realized it was matching the rhythm of my own panicked breathing. Every time I inhaled, the sound crescendoed. When I held my breath, it paused as well, waiting. Testing this theory filled me with a terror I'd never experienced. The understanding that whatever intelligence was controlling this convoy, it was aware of me on a level that went beyond mere observation. The highway ahead began to curve, a long sweeping bend that I'd driven hundreds of times before. But as the convoy navigated the curve, something impossible happened. The trucks ahead of me began moving in directions that defied physics, some appearing to slide sideways while maintaining forward motion, others seeming to occupy the same space as each other for brief moments before separating. The cargo that knew my name, from Marcus Del Vecchio. The thing about long-haul trucking is that eventually, you learn to appreciate the silence between your ears and the world outside your cab. 23 years I've been running these routes, and I thought I'd heard every sound a Peterbilt could make. Every whisper of wind through a poorly sealed door, every creak of cargo shifting in the trailer behind me. But that night in October, somewhere between Bakersfield and Barstow, I discovered there are sounds that don't belong to physics or mechanical wear. Sounds that seem to crawl up from places you didn't know existed. The load had come through dispatch as a priority rush, one of those mysterious shipments that pays double rate and asks no questions. 42,000 pounds of sealed wooden crates. Destination listed as a private facility outside Las Vegas. The paperwork was clean, the weight was legal, and the money was good enough to make me forget that in all my years on the road, I'd never seen wooden shipping crates that looked quite so old, quite so weathered, as if they'd been sitting in some forgotten warehouse since before I was born. I picked up the trailer from a depot in Fresno, just as the sun was painting the San Joaquin Valley in shades of amber and rust. The facility was one of those anonymous industrial lots surrounded by chain link and razor wire, the kind of place where workers wear name tags but never make eye contact. The forklift operator who loaded my trailer was a thin man with nervous hands who kept glancing at the crates as if they might suddenly sprout legs and walk away. When I asked him what was inside them, he just shrugged and said something about antique furniture, but his voice carried the kind of uncertainty that makes seasoned drivers like me start paying attention. The first few hundred miles passed without incident. My Peterbilt 379 hummed along Interstate 5 with the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to my life. 18 wheels eating up asphalt while the CB radio crackled with the familiar voices of other drivers, fighting off sleep and loneliness with coffee and conversation. The autumn evening was clear and cool, with a three-quarter moon casting silver light across the agricultural flatlands that stretched endlessly in both directions. I had my favorite playlist cycling through the stereo system, classic rock mixed with some Johnny Cash and a little bit of that ambient music my daughter had recommended, the kind that helps your mind settle into the meditative state that long-distance driving requires. It was somewhere around the junction with Highway 46, where the landscape begins its slow transition from farmland to desert, that I first noticed the whispering. At first I thought it might be wind finding its way through some gap in the trailer's weather ceiling, that soft susurrus that cargo haulers learn to ignore. But as I settled into the hypnotic rhythm of night driving, my ears began to detect patterns in the sound, cadences that seemed almost like speech, though so faint and indistinct that I couldn't make out individual words. I turned down the radio and listened more carefully, trying to isolate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from behind me, from the general direction of the trailer, though the way sound carries in a truck cab can be deceptive. The whispering rose and fell with the road noise, sometimes almost disappearing beneath the rumble of the diesel engine, sometimes becoming just clear enough that I found myself straining to understand what was being said, if indeed anything was being said at all. Miles passed, and still the whispering continued, growing neither louder nor softer but maintaining that same low, persistent murmur that began to feel like the sound of distant conversation heard through hotel walls. I tried adjusting my mirrors, checking my gauges, even pulling over at a rest stop to walk around the trailer and inspect the cargo area. But everything appeared normal. The wooden crates sat exactly where they'd been loaded, secured with heavy-duty straps and showing no signs of having shifted or settled during transit. Back in the cab, I tried to convince myself that the sound was nothing more than my imagination working overtime during the lonely hours of night driving. Every trucker knows about the tricks your mind can play when you've been staring at white lines and taillights for too many hours, the way shadows can seem to move in your peripheral vision, and how the monotonous drone of highway travel can make you hear voices in the wind. But as I merged back onto the interstate and resumed my journey toward the desert, the whispering returned with it, that same soft, persistent murmur that seemed to be trying to tell me something important, something I needed to hear. The landscape outside my windows grew increasingly desolate as I left the Central Valley behind and began the long climb into the foothills of the Coast Range. Here, the highway cut through rolling hills covered in dry grass and scattered oak trees, their branches creating twisted silhouettes against the moonlit sky. The few other vehicles on the road seemed to be traveling with unusual haste, their headlights appearing briefly in my mirrors before disappearing into the darkness ahead or behind, leaving me alone with my mysterious cargo and its whispered secrets. It was during one of these solitary stretches, somewhere near the town of Lost Hills, that I first began to make out individual words in the whispering. They came in fragments, disconnected syllables that flitted in and out of audibility like radio signals from a distant station. At first they seemed random, meaningless combinations of sounds that my overtired brain was assembling into familiar patterns. But gradually, horribly, I began to recognize them as words I knew, words that had meaning, words that belonged to my own life and history. "Sarah," came the whisper, soft as silk against glass. Sarah Michelle Del Vecchio. My daughter's full name spoken with such perfect pronunciation that I felt a chill run down my spine despite the cab's efficient heating system. I hadn't told anyone at the depot about my family, hadn't mentioned my daughter during the brief paperwork exchange, yet somehow that name was drifting up from the cargo behind me like smoke from a hidden fire. Born September 14th, 1992, the whisper continued, growing slightly more distinct now, as if encouraged by my attention. Graduated summa cum laude from UC Davis with a degree in veterinary medicine. Currently working at the Animal Medical Center in Riverside, California. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror that showed only darkness and the faint outline of the trailer's cargo doors. The information was accurate, every detail correct, but there was no way anyone at that depot could have known these things about my life. No way the sound could be coming from inanimate wooden crates filled with what was supposed to be antique furniture. The whispering continued, relentlessly cataloging the intimate details of my existence with the precision of a government file and the gentleness of a mother's bedtime story. It spoke of my ex-wife Linda, mentioning the small scar on her left temple from a childhood accident. Information I had never shared with anyone because Linda was always self-conscious about it. It whispered about my brother Tony's gambling problem, the one that had cost him his marriage and his electrical contracting business, the one our family had agreed never to discuss with outsiders. It recounted the exact amount of money I had in my savings account, down to the last penny, and the details of the speeding ticket I'd received 3 months earlier in Nebraska. a ticket I'd paid quietly without mentioning it to anyone. As the miles accumulated beneath my wheels and the whispers continued their systematic invasion of my privacy, I began to feel a growing sense of violation that went beyond mere unease. This wasn't just strange or unexplained. It was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Whatever was in those wooden crates had somehow gained access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. Secrets and private details that existed nowhere but in official records and my own memory. The highway began its descent toward the San Joaquin Valley floor, where the lights of small farming communities twinkled like scattered stars in the vast darkness. Normally, this part of the journey brought me a sense of peace, the lights representing human warmth and connection in the midst of the vast emptiness. But tonight they seemed distant and cold, as if they belonged to a world I was no longer part of. A world of normal people living normal lives, people whose secrets weren't being whispered by their cargo. "You were 17 when you stole that car," the voice murmured, and I felt my blood turn to ice water. "A blue 1987 Honda Civic belonging to Mrs. Peterson, your neighbor. You only drove it around the block, then parked it back in her driveway. But you never told anyone. Not your parents, not the police when they questioned the neighborhood kids, not even Father Martinez when you went to confession the following Sunday. That incident had happened over 30 years ago, in a different state, in a different life. I'd been a stupid teenager testing boundaries, seeing what I could get away with, and the guilt had eaten at me for months afterward." The Wheel That Wouldn't Rest, from Danny Kowalski. I've been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years now, and I thought I'd seen every kind of mechanical failure a truck could throw at me. Blown transmissions, seized engines, brake lines that snap in the middle of a mountain pass. But what happened to me last October on that lonely stretch of Highway 287 through Nebraska wasn't mechanical at all, and it still keeps me up at night, staring at the ceiling of whatever motel room I'm calling home. It started when I picked up that old Kenworth from a depot outside Omaha. The dispatcher, a thin man with nervous eyes, seemed eager to get the rig off his lot. Said it had been sitting there for months after the previous driver just walked away from it one morning, left his logbooks, his CB radio, even his coffee mug still sitting on the dashboard with a ring of mold growing around the rim. Management figured the guy had some kind of breakdown, maybe couldn't handle the road anymore. It happens more than people think in this business. The truck itself looked solid enough from the outside. A 1987 Kenworth W900, forest green with chrome that still caught the light despite its age. The engine turned over smooth as silk, and the transmission shifted clean through all 18 gears. Everything seemed fine except for one small thing that the depot manager mentioned almost as an afterthought. Sometimes, he said, scratching his head with a dirty fingernail, the front passenger wheel would spin when the truck was parked, just a slow rotation, like it was trying to remember being in motion. He figured it was something to do with the differential, maybe a sticking brake caliper, nothing that couldn't wait for the next scheduled maintenance. I should have paid more attention to the way he avoided looking at that wheel when he said it. The first few days of driving went without incident. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment down to Texas, taking my time on the back roads because the highways were clogged with construction. The Kenworth ran like a dream, eating up the miles with that steady diesel purr that becomes almost like a heartbeat after you've been driving long enough. The steering was tight, the brakes responsive, and even the air conditioning worked better than it had any right to in a truck that old. But on the third night, parked at a rest stop somewhere between nowhere and the middle of Kansas, I noticed it for the first time. I'd pulled in around 11 p.m., tired from fighting crosswinds all day and ready to grab a few hours of sleep before the morning push. The rest stop was one of those forgotten places that dot the prairie. Just a few picnic tables, some vending machines that probably hadn't been serviced since the Clinton administration, and a pair of flickering streetlights that seemed to push the darkness around rather than actually illuminating anything. I was the only vehicle there except for a sedan parked way over by the restrooms. So far away I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. After I'd finished my post-trip inspection and logged my hours, I climbed up into the sleeper berth and was just settling in with a paperback novel when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, rhythmic and persistent, like someone dragging their feet in gravel. At first I thought it might be the wind stirring up debris, but the night was still. So still I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. I stuck my head up toward the front of the cab and peered out through the windshield, and that's when I saw the wheel turning. The front passenger wheel was rotating slowly, maybe one revolution every 10 seconds. The tire treads catching what little light there was from the distant street lamps. It wasn't fast enough to move the truck, wasn't even fast enough to be particularly noticeable unless you were really looking, but it was definitely turning. The soft scraping sound was the tire against the asphalt, a whisper of rubber on stone that seemed unnaturally loud in the prairie quiet. I sat there watching it for maybe 5 minutes, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Air pressure equalizing in the brake lines, maybe, or some kind of hydraulic leak causing the wheel to turn as fluid escaped the system. These old trucks were full of quirks, and after 2 decades behind the wheel, I'd learned not to panic at every unusual sound or movement, but there was something hypnotic about that slow rotation, something that made it hard to look away. The wheel seemed to be turning with purpose, as if it knew exactly where it wanted to go and was just waiting for the rest of the truck to catch up. I found myself counting the rotations, watching the same scuff mark on the sidewall pass by the fender again and again, until my eyes grew heavy and I drifted off to sleep with the soft scraping sound filling my dreams. When I woke up 6 hours later, the wheel was still. The next day I mentioned it to a mechanic at a truck stop outside Wichita, describing the slow rotation and asking if he'd ever seen anything like it. He listened with the patient expression of someone who'd heard every possible truck story, then shrugged and suggested it might be a seized bearing or a problem with the brake drum. "Could be dangerous," he said, "if the wheel locked up while I was driving." He offered to take a look, but I was already behind schedule and the wheel hadn't given me any trouble on the road. I figured I'd have it checked out when I reached my destination. That was a mistake. The second time I noticed the spinning wheel was 3 nights later, at a way station that had been closed for hours. I'd parked there because it was official and well lit, a place where I could catch a few hours of rest without worrying about local police hassling me about overnight parking. But as I was settling in for the night, there it was again. That same slow, deliberate rotation, the tire turning against the pavement with that soft scraping sound that seemed to echo off the empty buildings. This time I decided to get a closer look. I put on my boots and climbed down from the cab, flashlight in hand. The night was warm and humid, with that heavy feeling that comes before a thunderstorm, and the air smelled of dust and approaching rain. As I walked around to the passenger side of the truck, I could hear the wheel more clearly, a steady rhythm like a grandfather clock made of rubber and steel. Up close, the movement was even more unsettling. The wheel wasn't just turning, it was turning smoothly, without any of the jerky motion you'd expect from a mechanical malfunction. It rotated as if it were connected to some invisible engine, driven by forces I couldn't see or understand. I knelt down and shined my flashlight on the brake assembly, looking for signs of hydraulic leakage or mechanical failure. But everything appeared normal. The brake lines were dry, the drum housing was intact, and there were no obvious problems with the suspension or steering components, but the wheel kept turning, patient and relentless, marking time against the asphalt. I reached out to touch the tire, thinking maybe I could stop it manually, but as my fingers got close to the moving rubber, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. It wasn't a physical cold, but something else. Something that made every instinct I had scream at me to pull my hand back. So I did, standing up quickly and backing away from the wheel, watching it continue its slow rotation in the beam of my flashlight. That's when I noticed the sedan. It was the same car I'd seen at the rest stop 3 nights earlier, or at least one just like it. Dark colored, maybe blue or black, parked about 50 yards away in the shadows beyond the way station building. I couldn't see inside because of the distance and the darkness, but something about its presence made me deeply uneasy. It hadn't been there when I'd pulled in an hour earlier. I was sure of that. The way station had been completely empty when I'd parked. I stood there in the humid night air, listening to the soft scraping of the wheel and staring at the motionless sedan, trying to decide what to do. Every reasonable part of my mind was telling me to get back in the truck and ignore both the spinning wheel and the mysterious car, to catch some sleep and deal with whatever was happening in the morning when things would seem less strange and threatening. But the wheel kept turning, and the sedan sat there in the darkness like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I realized that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop just because I wanted it to. I climbed back into the cab and started the engine, not bothering with my pre-trip inspection or my logbook entries. I just wanted to get away from that place, to put some distance between myself and whatever was following me. As I pulled out of the way station, I checked my mirrors and saw the sedan's headlights flicker on, maintaining the same 50-yard distance as I accelerated onto the highway. For the next 2 hours, through small towns and empty farmland, the sedan stayed behind me, not close enough to be threatening, not far enough away to be coincidental. The road that doesn't exist, from Marcus Delroy. I've been driving truck for 37 years, and I thought I knew every highway, back road, and forgotten stretch of asphalt from here to the Canadian border. My Peterbilt 379 and I have rolled through snowstorms that could bury a school bus, dodged tornadoes that turned the sky green as old copper, and navigated fog so thick you couldn't see your own hood ornament. But nothing in all those years prepared me for the night I found Route 000. It started like any other late haul, picking up a load of electronics in Denver bound for a distribution center outside Chicago. The dispatcher, Jenny, handed me the paperwork with her usual tired smile, but something felt different about the shipping manifest. The destination address seemed to shimmer slightly on the page, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, and when I blinked, the numbers looked different somehow. I chalked it up to exhaustion and too much truck stop coffee burning holes in my retinas. The evening air carried that crisp bite of early autumn as I pulled out of the yard, my 18-wheeler settling into the familiar rhythm of the interstate. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter between drivers, weather reports, and warnings about speed traps, creating that comfortable background noise that keeps you company during the long hours ahead. My dashboard lights cast their warm amber glow across the cab, and the steady rumble of the Caterpillar engine beneath the hood provided its usual reassuring vibration through the steering wheel. Miles rolled by in their predictable pattern, truck stops and rest areas marking time like mile markers on an endless calendar. The GPS mounted on my dashboard showed the familiar blue line of Interstate 80 stretching ahead. But somewhere around midnight, as I was climbing through the mountains of Colorado, the screen flickered. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw an additional route branching off from the main highway, labeled simply as Route 00 in the same standard font the GPS used for all other roads. When I glanced back at the screen, it showed only the usual interstate, but that brief glimpse nagged at me like a song you can't quite remember. The radio had gone quiet too, which was unusual for a Friday night when drivers typically stayed chatty to fight off the drowsiness that comes with the territory. I tried raising someone on Channel 19, but got nothing back except the soft hiss of static that seemed almost like whispered words in a language I couldn't understand. The mountains rose around me like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds that reflected the occasional lightning from a storm system moving through the area. Rain began to spatter against my windshield, not the heavy downpour that would make driving treacherous, but those intermittent drops that require the wipers on their slowest setting. The rhythmic sweep of the blades created a hypnotic pattern, and I found myself counting the intervals between drops, each one seeming to match the beating of my own heart. That's when I saw the sign. It appeared in my headlights like a ghost materializing from the darkness, weathered green metal reflecting the light with that particular dullness that comes from decades of mountain weather. But instead of showing mile markers or town names, this sign simply read Route 001, mile, with an arrow pointing toward what looked like an off-ramp that definitely hadn't been there when I'd driven this stretch. 3 weeks earlier on my last eastbound run, the GPS screen flickered again, and this time the Route 00 marking stayed visible, appearing as a thin red line that branched off from the interstate and seemed to curve away into areas the map showed as completely blank. No towns, no geographic features, just empty space where a road apparently existed that no cartographer had ever bothered to document. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, and something about that blank space called to me with the same curiosity that had gotten me into trucking in the first place, back when the open road represented freedom and possibilities rather than schedules and delivery deadlines. I found myself taking the exit almost without conscious decision, my hands turning the steering wheel as if guided by some external force. The off-ramp curved more sharply than seemed physically possible, and I had to downshift to keep the trailer from jackknifing as we descended into what felt like a valley that hadn't existed moments before. The rain stopped abruptly, not tapering off naturally, but simply ending as if I'd driven through an invisible barrier, and the air outside my windows took on a strange quality, thick and still, like the atmosphere inside a sealed building. Route 000 stretched ahead of me, perfectly paved and marked with regulation yellow lines, but something about it felt fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The road surface seemed too smooth, too perfect, lacking the usual wear patterns and imperfections that develop naturally over time. No tire tracks marked the asphalt. No oil stains or skid marks suggested that other vehicles had ever traveled this particular stretch of highway. Even more unsettling, the white and yellow paint appeared fresh, as if it had been applied just hours before, but the road itself felt ancient, like it had been waiting in this place far longer than highways had existed anywhere else in the world. My headlights carved twin tunnels through darkness that seemed more complete than ordinary night, revealing landscape that didn't match the familiar geography of Colorado. Instead of mountain slopes and pine forests, flat grasslands stretched away on both sides of the road, grass that moved in patterns that didn't correspond to any wind I could feel. The movement was too uniform, too rhythmic, like the breathing of some vast sleeping creature, and occasionally I caught glimpses of what might have been structures in the distance, geometric shapes that vanished when I tried to focus on them directly. The CB radio came alive with a burst of static, and through the white noise I heard what sounded like other drivers talking. But their voices seemed to come from very far away, and they were discussing routes and destinations I'd never heard of. One voice mentioned delivering a load to Millbrook Falls, which wasn't on any map I knew, while another talked about avoiding construction on Highway 13. But we were nowhere near any Highway 13, and besides, the voices had a hollow quality, as if they were echoing from the bottom of a deep well. I glanced at my GPS and discovered that the device no longer showed my location at all. The screen displayed a maze of interconnected roads, none of which corresponded to any real geography, and the little truck icon that usually marked my position had disappeared entirely. According to the satellite navigation system, I simply didn't exist, traveling through empty space on a road that couldn't be found on any chart. My cell phone showed no signal bars, which wasn't unusual in the mountains, but the display seemed dimmer than normal, as if the device were slowly running out of power despite being plugged into the truck's electrical system. Mile markers began appearing alongside the roadway, but instead of the sequential numbering system used on regular highways, these showed symbols that looked almost like numbers but weren't quite right. characters that seemed to shift slightly when viewed through peripheral vision. The shapes reminded me of highway markers I'd seen in dreams, familiar enough to seem normal at first glance, but strange enough to create a nagging sense of wrongness that grew stronger with each passing mile. Other trucks began appearing in my mirrors, following at a distance that seemed perfectly calculated to remain just at the edge of visibility. When I slowed down, they slowed down, maintaining that exact interval that kept them hovering like mirages at the very limit of my sight. I tried using the radio to hail them, but got no response except that same whispered static that might have been voices speaking words in a language that predated human speech. The trucks themselves looked familiar yet wrong, like my own Peterbilt, but with proportions that didn't quite match, trailer configurations that seemed impossible, and headlights that burned with colors that weren't quite white. The landscape around Route 00 continued to change as I drove deeper into whatever territory the road traversed. Rolling grasslands gave way to forests of trees that grew in perfectly straight lines, their branches forming geometric patterns that looked more architectural than natural. Small structures appeared between the trees, buildings that might have been houses or barns but were built in styles that didn't match any regional architecture I'd encountered in nearly 4 decades of cross-country driving. Lights flickered in some of the windows, but the illumination had that same off-color quality as the headlights of the trucks following behind me, and sometimes I caught glimpses of movement that seemed too fluid, too flowing to be entirely human. My fuel gauge began behaving strangely, the needle moving in small increments that didn't correspond to actual consumption, sometimes rising slightly even though the engine continued burning diesel at its normal rate. Time itself seemed to be flowing differently here, my dashboard clock displaying numbers that changed in patterns I couldn't predict, jumping forward by several minutes and then moving backward by nearly an hour, as if the passage of moments followed different rules in this place that existed between the margins of ordinary geography. A sign appeared in my headlights announcing, "Rest area, 2 miles," and despite every instinct screaming warnings, I found myself desperately wanting to stop. The Midnight Fuel Stop, from Jake Morrison. The highway stretched endlessly before me that September night, its asphalt ribbon disappearing into darkness beyond my headlight beams. I'd been driving for nearly 14 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Denver, and my eyelids felt heavy as lead weights. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a harsh 2:47 a.m., and my fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty. That's when I saw the neon glow cutting through the desert darkness ahead, the familiar sight of a truck stop beacon calling to weary drivers like myself. The place looked like a relic from the 70s, all chrome and faded paint with a sign that simply read Desert Rose Fuel, in letters that had seen better decades. 3 fuel islands sat beneath flickering fluorescent lights, each one numbered in peeling vinyl digits. As I pulled my 18-wheeler into the lot, gravel crunching beneath my tires, I noticed I wasn't alone. At pump number 3 sat another big rig, a beautiful old Peterbilt that gleamed silver and chrome despite the harsh overhead lighting. Something about that truck made me pause as I maneuvered toward pump 1. It was pristine, absolutely pristine, as if it had just rolled off a showroom floor from 1978. The paint job was flawless midnight blue with silver flames dancing along the sides, and every piece of chrome caught the fluorescent light like liquid mercury. The cab sat high and proud on perfectly aligned wheels, and even the mud flaps hung at perfect angles without a speck of road grime. In 30 years of trucking, I'd never seen a working rig maintained to such museum-quality standards. The engine wasn't running, but I could swear I heard something. A low rhythmic humming that seemed to pulse through the ground beneath my boots. As I climbed down from my cab, the desert wind carried the faintest scent of diesel exhaust mixed with something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a funeral parlor. The hair on my arms stood up despite the warm night air. and I found myself glancing repeatedly at that beautiful Peterbilt as I began fueling my own truck. The fuel nozzle felt cold in my hands, colder than it should have been on a September night in Arizona. As diesel flowed into my tank, I kept stealing looks at pump 3, trying to spot the other driver. The Peterbilt's cab was dark, its windows tinted so heavily that I couldn't see inside, but surely someone had to be nearby. Truck stops at this hour were usually bustling with drivers grabbing coffee, checking their logs, stretching their legs. Yet the parking lot felt eerily quiet, as if sound itself was being swallowed by the desert darkness beyond the reach of those stuttering fluorescent lights. The fuel pump clicked off sooner than expected, and I realized my tank hadn't taken nearly as much diesel as the gauge had indicated. Strange, but maybe the sensor was acting up again. As I hung up the nozzle, a gust of wind rattled the metal overhang above the pumps, creating a sound like distant thunder. That's when I noticed the numbers on the Peterbilt's license plate, or rather noticed that I couldn't quite make them out. They seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them, as if they were written in smoke rather than stamped in metal. Curiosity got the better of me, as it often does during those long, lonely nights on the road. I walked slowly toward pump 3, my boots echoing strangely on the concrete. The humming sound grew stronger with each step, not mechanical like a running engine, but organic somehow, like the drone of insects or the whisper of wind through empty spaces. The Peterbilt's chrome bumper reflected my image back at me, but the reflection looked wrong, distorted in a way that couldn't be explained by the curved surface of the metal. As I drew closer, I could see that the fuel hose was connected to the truck's tank, but the pump display showed all zeros. No gallons dispensed, no dollar amount, nothing. Yet I could hear liquid flowing, that distinct gurgle of fuel moving through hoses and into a tank. The smell of flowers grew stronger, mixing with diesel fumes and something else I couldn't identify. Something that made my stomach turn and my head feel light. The driver's door of the Peterbilt bore no company name or logo, just that flawless midnight blue paint that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I leaned in closer to peer through the tinted window, pressing my face almost against the glass. Inside, I could make out the shape of someone sitting behind the wheel, motionless as a statue. The figure wore what looked like a trucker's cap and jacket, but in the darkness and through the heavy tint, I couldn't make out any details of face or features. I knocked gently on the window, the sound sharp in the desert stillness. "Hey there, driver," I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I expected. "Beautiful rig you got here." The figure didn't move, didn't respond, didn't even turn its head in acknowledgement. I knocked again, harder this time, and the sound seemed to echo strangely, as if the truck's interior was much larger than it should have been. That's when I noticed the date on the fuel pump's display. September 15th, 1978. I blinked and looked again, certain I had misread it, but the numbers remained unchanged. That was impossible, of course. Digital displays like that weren't even common in the 70s, and besides, today was September 15th, 2023. Exactly 45 years later, I realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. I stepped back from the truck, my heart beginning to pound in a rhythm that matched that strange humming sound. The fluorescent lights above pump 3 began to flicker more rapidly, casting shifting shadows that made the Peterbilt seem to shimmer and waver like a mirage. But this was no desert illusion born of heat and distance. This was something else entirely. Something that made every instinct I'd developed in 3 decades of late-night driving scream at me to get back in my cab and drive away as fast as my engine could take me. But I couldn't move. I stood transfixed as the humming grew louder, more insistent, and the smell of funeral flowers became almost overwhelming. The fuel pump display at pump 3 began to flicker, numbers appearing and disappearing in rapid succession. Gallons dispensed, dollars charged, but none of it made sense. The numbers seemed to be cycling through years of transactions, decades of fuel stops, thousands upon thousands of fill-ups that had never actually happened. The figure in the truck's cab finally moved, turning its head toward me with mechanical precision. Through the tinted window, I caught a glimpse of what should have been a face but wasn't. Just shadow beneath the brim of that trucker's cap, shadow that seemed to move independently of any light source. The passenger door of the Peterbilt swung open with a soft click that somehow carried clearly across the fuel island. I found myself taking a step toward that open door, then another, as if my legs were moving without any input from my brain. The humming sound was inside my head now, drowning out my own thoughts, replacing them with images of endless highways and truck stops that existed only in memory. I could see other drivers, dozens of them, all walking toward that same open door over the span of decades. All of them wearing the same expression of confused fascination that I could feel spreading across my own face. The interior of the Peterbilt's cab glowed with a soft, phosphorescent light that had no visible source. The seats were pristine leather, the dashboard polished wood and chrome, everything perfect and new despite the truck's apparent age. But the space inside was wrong, stretched and distorted so that the back wall of the sleeper berth seemed miles away, fading into darkness that no light could penetrate. The CB radio crackled with voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, conversations that might have been taking place across decades or dimensions. I was at the passenger door now, 1 foot on the running board, when the sound of my own diesel engine turning over broke through the supernatural humming that had clouded my thoughts. I hadn't started my truck. The keys were still in my pocket, but there it was, rumbling to life with a sound as familiar as my own heartbeat. The mundane, mechanical noise cut through whatever spell or compulsion had been drawing me toward that impossibly deep cab, and suddenly I could think clearly again. I jerked my foot back from the running board and stumbled away from the Peterbilt, nearly falling as my legs remembered how to obey my own commands rather than some otherworldly summons. The passenger door swung shut with finality, and the humming sound cut off abruptly, leaving only the welcome rumble of my own truck's engine and the buzz of struggling fluorescent lights. The Morning Engine, from Jake Carver. I've been hauling freight across the back roads of Montana for nearly 20 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd heard every sound a diesel engine could make. The throaty rumble of a well-tuned Caterpillar, the wheeze of worn injectors, the knock of carbon buildup in the cylinders. But what started happening with my old Peterbilt 379 3 weeks ago was something altogether different. Something that makes me question whether I should have retired that truck to the scrapyard instead of nursing it through one more season. The first time I noticed it was during a late September run from Billings to Missoula, carrying a load of farm equipment. The autumn air had that crisp bite that cuts through your jacket, and fog was beginning to settle in the valleys between the rolling hills. I was about 2 hours out of Billings, somewhere along Highway 2, when the engine began making what I initially mistook for a vacuum leak. It was a low, almost musical sound that seemed to rise and fall with the RPMs, like air escaping through a crack in the intake manifold. I pulled over at the next rest stop and popped the hood, running my hands along the air lines and checking the connections. Everything seemed tight. The turbo wasn't whistling, the belts weren't squealing, and all the gauges read normal. I wrote it off as another quirk of an aging engine and continued on my way. The sound persisted, but it wasn't affecting performance, so I decided to have it looked at when I reached my destination. As the miles rolled beneath my wheels and the fog grew thicker, coating my windshield with a fine mist that the wipers couldn't quite clear, I began to notice something unsettling about that sound. It wasn't constant like a mechanical problem would be. Instead, it seemed to pulse and breathe, rising to a peak before trailing off into silence only to begin again moments later. The rhythm was too organic, too human. It reminded me of something I couldn't quite place, a memory hovering just beyond reach. The highway stretched ahead of me like a dark ribbon, illuminated only by the amber glow of my headlights cutting through the thickening fog. Other traffic was sparse at this hour. just the occasional set of taillights disappearing into the murk ahead, or the brief flash of oncoming headlights before they vanished behind me. The radio had begun picking up static, the classic country station fading in and out until I finally switched it off, leaving me alone with the steady hum of the road and that strange, almost musical emanation from beneath the hood. As I descended into a particularly deep valley where the fog hung like a living thing, dense and gray and reaching across the asphalt with ghostly fingers, the sound changed. What had been a mere mechanical oddity transformed into something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The low rhythmic noise had taken on an unmistakably human quality, like someone drawing breath to speak but never quite managing to form words. It rose and fell with an emotional cadence that spoke of loss, of longing, of some deep and inconsolable grief. I tried to convince myself it was just the acoustics of the valley playing tricks on my ears, the way sound bounces off hills and trees in unexpected ways. But as I listened more carefully, adjusting my speed to change the engine's pitch, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the normal places you'd expect mechanical noise. It seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, from the very heart of the machine, as if the truck itself had developed vocal cords and was trying to communicate something urgent and sorrowful. The fog had grown so thick now that I could barely see 20 feet ahead of me, my headlights reflecting back in an impenetrable wall of gray-white vapor. I slowed to a crawl, hazard lights blinking, following the yellow line at the edge of the asphalt like a lifeline through the murk. That's when the sound evolved again, becoming something that made my blood run cold. The wordless moaning had taken on the unmistakable timbre of human grief, the sound of someone who had lost everything they held dear and was pouring their anguish into the night air. I pulled over to the shoulder, my hands shaking slightly as I engaged the parking brake. The engine continued to idle, and with it came that heartbreaking sound, now so clearly resembling human crying that I found myself looking around the cab to make sure I was alone. The sound seemed to emanate not just from the engine compartment, but from the very frame of the truck, as if the steel and iron had absorbed decades of sorrow from the countless drivers who had sat behind the wheel, and was now releasing it back into the world. My mind raced through the truck's history. I'd bought it used 5 years ago from a dealer in Spokane who'd been eager to move it off his lot. The previous owner, he'd told me, was an old-timer named Hank Morrison who'd driven that route between Montana and Washington for 30 years before his retirement. The dealer mentioned that Morrison had seemed reluctant to part with the truck, standing in the lot for nearly an hour after signing the papers, his hand resting on the fender like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. As I sat there in the fog-shrouded darkness, listening to what could only be described as the truck mourning, I remembered something else the dealer had mentioned almost as an afterthought. Morrison's wife had died of cancer during his last year of driving, and he'd continued working right up until the funeral, refusing to take time off because, as he put it, the road was the only place he could think clearly about everything they'd shared and lost. The moaning grew louder, more insistent, and I noticed that the fog outside was beginning to take on strange shapes, swirling patterns that almost looked like figures reaching through the mist. The temperature gauge was reading normal, but the air inside the cab had grown noticeably colder, my breath beginning to fog the windshield from the inside. The sound had become so human, so filled with recognizable emotion, that I found myself wanting to respond to it, to offer some kind of comfort to whatever presence was making itself known. That's when I heard something that nearly made my heart stop. Mixed in with the mechanical moaning was another sound, fainter but distinctly different. It was a woman's voice calling a name I couldn't quite make out through the fog and the engine noise. The voice was distant, ethereal, like someone calling across a great divide. The engine's mournful sound seemed to respond, rising in pitch and intensity as if trying to answer that faraway call. I realized I needed to get moving again. But as I reached for the gear shift, the engine's note changed once more. The moaning became urgent, almost frantic, and the fog around the truck began to swirl more violently. Through the gray murk, I could swear I saw the silhouette of a figure standing beside the road, barely visible but unmistakably human. The woman's voice grew clearer, more insistent, and the engine responded with what I can only describe as mechanical sobbing, deep and resonant and filled with a longing that seemed to shake the very chassis of the truck. My hands were trembling as I put the truck in gear and began to pull back onto the highway. As soon as the wheels started rolling, the fog began to thin and the voices faded, but the engine continued its mournful song. I drove through the night with that sound as my companion, a melody of loss and yearning that seemed to tell the story of every mile Morrison had driven after his wife's death. Every night he'd spent alone in the cab with only memories and the endless road ahead. By the time I reached Missoula, dawn was beginning to break through the dissipating fog, and the strange sounds had faded to nothing more than the normal diesel rumble I knew so well. I had the truck looked at by 3 different mechanics over the next week, but none of them could find anything wrong. The engine ran perfectly, they assured me. Just some normal aging in the exhaust system that might cause a bit of harmonic resonance under certain conditions. But I know what I heard out there in the fog, and I know it wasn't just mechanical noise. Every time I take that route now, especially on foggy nights when the air is thick and the world feels close and intimate, the morning begins again. The engine sings its song of loss, and sometimes, just sometimes, I hear that distant voice calling back, growing fainter with each passing month, as if whatever connection once existed is slowly fading with time and distance. I've thought about selling the truck, finding something newer and less haunted, but somehow I can't bring myself to do it. Maybe it's because I understand now that I'm not just hauling freight across these endless highways. I'm carrying the memories of every driver who came before me. The keeper of stories that need to be remembered. The guardian of a love so strong it found a way to echo through steel and diesel fuel and the rhythm of wheels on asphalt. The night that follows you. From Marcus. The thing about driving nights is that you start to notice patterns in the darkness. Little rhythms that most folks never see because they're tucked safe in their beds while I'm out here hauling freight across the endless interstate. My Peterbilt 379 has been my companion for going on 15 years now. Her chrome gleaming under truck stoplights, her diesel engine humming that deep, steady song that's become more familiar to me than my own heartbeat. But 3 weeks ago, somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City, I started noticing something that didn't fit the pattern, something that's been riding alongside me ever since, and I'm beginning to think it's not planning to let me go. It started with the headlights in my mirror, which isn't unusual on its own because these highways are veins of commerce that never sleep, carrying blood in the form of 18-wheelers, delivery trucks, and the occasional night owl in a sedan pushing through to somewhere important. But these headlights were different, sitting at that perfect distance behind me where they caught my attention without being close enough for me to make out what kind of vehicle they belonged to. They maintained that exact spacing for nearly 200 miles, never gaining, never falling back, just there like a patient shadow waiting for something I couldn't understand. The first night I noticed them, I convinced myself it was coincidence, just another driver heading the same direction with cruise control set to match my speed. I've been driving long enough to know that truckers often fall into these informal convoys, especially on the long, lonely stretches where the only company is the distant glow of oncoming traffic and the static-filled voices on the CB radio. The headlights stayed with me until I pulled into a rest stop outside Tulsa, and when I emerged from the facilities and climbed back into my cab, they were gone, leaving me with nothing but the usual collection of taillights disappearing into the distance ahead. But the next night, as I rolled out of Little Rock with a load of auto parts bound for Memphis, there they were again in my mirrors, settling into that same comfortable distance like they'd been waiting for me to return to the road. This time I paid closer attention, trying to gauge the height and spacing of the lights, looking for any detail that might tell me what I was dealing with. They seemed too high to be a car, too close together to be another big rig, but the darkness between us swallowed everything except those two steady points of light that never wavered, never blinked, never gave me any hint of their nature. The radio crackled with the usual chatter, drivers sharing information about weather conditions ahead, warning each other about smoky bears and construction zones. But when I keyed the mic to ask if anyone else was seeing what I was seeing, the responses came back negative. Either my followers were running dark on the CB, or the other drivers couldn't see what had been tracking me across 3 states. And neither possibility offered much comfort as I watched those persistent lights maintain their vigil in my mirrors. By the end of the first week, I'd started changing my routes, taking different highways and making unscheduled stops trying to shake whatever was back there. But it didn't matter where I went or how many detours I took through small towns and back roads that barely qualified as truck routes. The headlights would always reappear, sometimes immediately, sometimes after I'd driven for hours thinking I'd finally lost them, but always settling back into that same position like they belonged there, like they'd claimed some invisible territory in the space behind my trailer and had no intention of giving it up. The strangest part was how they never came closer, never tried to pass, never did anything that would typically mark them as aggressive or threatening. They simply existed back there, constant as the North Star, following me through rain that turned my windshield into a kaleidoscope of fractured light, through fog so thick I could barely see my own hood, through clear nights when every star seemed close enough to touch, but those headlights remained exactly as distant and mysterious as ever. Sleep became elusive during my mandatory rest periods, not because I was afraid exactly, but because I couldn't stop thinking about what might be waiting in the darkness behind my cab, patient and inexplicable as some cosmic force that had decided to take interest in one particular truck driver, for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively, even when I was parked and shut down for the night, half expecting to see those lights stationed at the edge of the truck stop, watching and waiting for me to fire up the engine and resume whatever game we'd been playing across the highways of America. The other drivers started to notice my distraction during our brief conversations at fuel stops and way stations, commenting that I looked tired, asking if everything was all right. But how do you explain to someone that you're being followed by headlights that might not even be attached to an actual vehicle, that you're starting to suspect you've picked up some kind of supernatural hitchhiker that feeds on diesel fumes and the loneliness of long-haul driving? They would have recommended I take some time off, maybe see a doctor, and perhaps they would have been right. But the thought of leaving my truck sitting idle while those lights waited for my return seemed worse than continuing to live with their constant presence. It was during the second week, somewhere in the vast emptiness between Flagstaff and Barstow, that I finally worked up the nerve to try something different. Instead of maintaining my steady pace and pretending not to notice my persistent shadows, I began gradually reducing my speed, dropping from 70 to 60 to 50, watching my mirrors to see how they would react to this change in our established routine. For the first few minutes, nothing happened, the lights maintaining their distance as my speedometer continued its downward slide. But then something shifted in the darkness behind me. The lights began to grow larger, brighter, as if whatever carried them was finally closing the gap that had separated us for hundreds of miles. And I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel as anticipation mixed with dread in the pit of my stomach. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? Some kind of resolution to the mystery that had been gnawing at the edges of my sanity. But as those lights swelled in my mirrors like approaching stars, I realized I might have made a terrible mistake in inviting this confrontation. My CB radio erupted in static, not the usual interference that sometimes plagued communications in remote areas, but something that sounded almost like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Syllables that seemed to crawl out of the speaker and fill my cab with an electric tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. The headlights continued their approach, growing so bright now that they washed out everything else in my mirrors, turning the familiar view of highway and darkness into a blazing white void that hurt to look at directly. Panic finally overcame curiosity, and I mashed the accelerator to the floor, feeling my faithful Peterbilt surge forward with all the power her engine could deliver, but the lights stayed with me, matching my acceleration with impossible ease, maintaining their steady approach despite my truck's desperate flight down the empty highway. The speedometer climbed past 80, past 90, speeds that should have been dangerous in a loaded 18-wheeler, but the lights continued, gaining ground as if the laws of physics had decided to take a brief vacation from our particular corner of the desert. Just when I thought those blazing headlights were about to overtake my trailer, about to reveal whatever impossible thing had been following me across half the continent, they suddenly vanished, winking out of existence as if someone had thrown a switch, leaving my mirrors dark and my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal, desperate for escape. I gradually reduced my speed back to legal limits, checking and rechecking my mirrors every few seconds. But the familiar emptiness of the highway stretched behind me without any sign of my mysterious pursuers. For 3 days, I drove through a normal world where my mirrors showed only the expected traffic, where my radio carried the usual conversations between drivers sharing the road, where I could almost convince myself that the whole experience had been some kind of hallucination, brought on by too much coffee and not enough sleep. I began to relax, to think that maybe I'd finally escaped whatever had attached itself to me, that the confrontation in the desert had somehow broken the connection that had bound us together. But last night, as I pulled out of a truck stop in Missouri with a load bound for Chicago, I saw them again in my mirrors, those patient, inexplicable lights settling into their familiar position behind me, like they'd never been away. Like our brief separation had been just an intermission in a performance that was far from over. They're back there now as I speak these words into my voice recorder, maintaining their eternal vigil, following me through the darkness with a persistence that suggests they have all the time in the world and nowhere else they need to be. I've stopped trying to understand what they want or where they came from. Stopped looking for logical explanations for something that seems to exist outside the boundaries of logic. But I can't shake the feeling that eventually they're going to want more from me than just the privilege of following behind my trailer. The living span from Marcus Webb. The GPS died 3 miles back, leaving nothing but static where the mechanical voice should have been, and I found myself squinting through the windshield of my Peterbilt at a stretch of highway that didn't match any map I'd ever studied. 22 years hauling freight across the continental United States, and I thought I knew every major route and back road from Seattle to Miami. But this particular stretch of asphalt seemed to have materialized from nowhere, cutting through a landscape that felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The darkness pressed against my headlights like black velvet, swallowing the illumination just yards ahead of my bumper, and the usual sounds of my rig had taken on an oddly muffled quality, as if the night air had grown thick and viscous. My load of industrial washing machines shifted slightly in the trailer behind me, creating a gentle metallic whisper that reminded me of wind chimes in a funeral parlor, though I couldn't explain why that particular comparison came to mind. The dashboard clock read 2:37 in the morning, but my internal chronometer insisted it should be closer to midnight, creating a disorienting sense that time itself had become unreliable. I'd been driving this route to deliver appliances to a warehouse in what the shipping manifest listed as Millbrook Township, though my usual dispatcher had seemed oddly vague about the exact location when I'd picked up the load in Cincinnati. The instructions were simple enough. Take Interstate 64 west for 200 miles, then follow the detour signs when the highway split. What he hadn't mentioned was that the detour would lead through countryside so desolate it seemed abandoned by civilization itself, past farmhouses with dark windows and grain silos that loomed like monoliths against the star-scattered sky. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, so I wasn't concerned about range. but something about the quality of the darkness ahead made me consider turning around and finding an alternate route. The problem was that I'd already committed to this path for nearly an hour, and the narrow two-lane road offered precious few opportunities to turn around a 70-foot combination vehicle. The asphalt stretched ahead like a ribbon of darker shadow against the charcoal landscape, and my headlights revealed nothing but empty road and the occasional reflector post marking the edge of what might charitably be called a shoulder. Then I saw the bridge. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a subtle change in the texture of the darkness ahead, a slightly different quality to the blackness that suggested elevation and spans. But as my headlights began to illuminate its approaches, I noticed that the usual concrete barriers and steel railings were absent, replaced by what appeared to be smooth, curved surfaces that reminded me of architectural elements I'd never quite seen before. The bridge seemed to rise from the landscape organically, as if it had grown rather than been constructed, its supports disappearing into the shadows below like the roots of some massive tree. As I drew closer, my headlights revealed details that made me ease off the accelerator and downshift to a lower gear. The surface of the bridge wasn't the familiar rough concrete or steel grating I expected, but something that appeared almost smooth, with a texture that seemed to shift subtly in the changing angle of my headlights. The color was difficult to determine in the artificial illumination, somewhere between cream and pale pink, with darker areas that might have been shadows or might have been something else entirely. The strangest aspect was the complete absence of any structural elements that I recognized. No expansion joints, no drainage systems, no safety barriers or warning signs. The bridge simply rose from the road in a gentle arc, its edges curving downward to meet the asphalt in seamless transitions that looked more like living tissue than engineering. I found myself thinking of the undersides of mushrooms, the way the gills formed organic curves that seemed both delicate and strong, though this comparison brought with it a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I brought the truck to a complete stop about 50 yards from the bridge's entrance, letting the diesel engine idle while I studied what lay ahead. In the steady glow of my headlights, the surface appeared to have the slightest suggestion of texture. Not quite smooth, but not rough either. More like the skin of some enormous creature that had been stretched across an invisible frame. There were no other lights visible anywhere in the surrounding darkness. No traffic approaching from the opposite direction. No indication that anyone else had passed this way recently. The logical part of my mind insisted that this was simply an unusual architectural choice, perhaps some experimental design, meant to blend infrastructure with the natural environment. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that had kept my ancestors alive when they faced things in the darkness that they couldn't understand, was sending urgent signals that something was fundamentally wrong with the scene before me. I reached for my CB radio, hoping to raise another driver who might be familiar with this route, but the channels offered nothing but static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in rural areas, but the complete absence of any electronic communication felt particularly isolating. The shipping company expected me to deliver this load by morning, and turning back would mean missing the deadline and potentially losing a contract that represented a significant portion of my annual income. After several minutes of indecision, I released the brakes and began to ease forward, reasoning that bridges were engineered to support far more weight than my loaded truck represented, regardless of their appearance. The approach felt normal enough, just slightly uphill as expected, but as my front wheels made contact with the bridge surface itself, I noticed that the usual sounds of tire noise and road vibration had changed to something softer, more muffled, as if I were driving across a thick carpet rather than a structural roadway. The sensation through the steering wheel was unlike anything I'd experienced in more than 2 decades of professional driving. Instead of the solid, unyielding feedback of concrete or steel, there was a subtle give to the surface, not enough to suggest structural weakness, but enough to create the disturbing impression that the bridge was somehow accommodating the weight of my truck, rather than simply supporting it. The feeling reminded me of walking across a thick gymnastics mat, where each step created a slight depression that rebounded after I'd passed. As I reached the midpoint of the span, I made the mistake of looking down through my driver's side window, hoping to glimpse the terrain below and orient myself geographically. What I saw instead made me grip the steering wheel with both hands and fight the urge to accelerate toward the far end of the bridge. Instead of the expected view of a river or valley, there was nothing but darkness that seemed to move with a subtle rhythmic motion, as if I were looking down into the chest cavity of some massive sleeping creature. The darkness below wasn't the simple absence of light that I'd expected, but something that seemed to have substance and depth, undulating gently in waves that suggested respiration. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of what might have been branching structures extending into the depths, too organic to be engineering supports, too regular to be natural formations. They pulsed with a faint luminescence that reminded me of deep-sea creatures I'd seen in nature documentaries, creating patterns of light that appeared almost like neural networks firing in slow motion. The surface beneath my wheels had begun to feel increasingly responsive, adjusting to the weight distribution of my truck in ways that seemed impossible for any known construction material. I could feel each slight turn of the steering wheel being translated into corresponding movements in the roadway itself, as if the bridge were anticipating my path and preparing to accommodate it. The sensation was deeply unnerving, like driving across the back of some enormous animal that was aware of my presence and adjusting its posture to keep me comfortable. My truck's suspension system, designed to absorb road irregularities and provide a smooth ride, seemed to be working in harmony with the bridge surface to create an almost unnaturally comfortable journey. The usual jolts and vibrations of highway travel had disappeared entirely, replaced by a gentle, rocking motion that reminded me of being carried rather than driving under my own power. Even the sound of my diesel engine seemed muffled and distant, as if the bridge were absorbing the noise and converting it into something more harmonious. Ahead of me, the far end of the bridge remained shrouded in darkness that my headlights couldn't quite penetrate, creating the illusion that the span continued indefinitely into the night. I checked my speedometer and found that I was maintaining a steady 45 miles per hour, which should have carried me across any normal bridge in a matter of seconds, but the exit seemed to be approaching with dreamlike slowness. The familiar landmarks that should have marked my progress, expansion joints, support structures, changes in elevation, were completely absent, making it impossible to judge how much distance remained. Then I became aware of a subtle sound that seemed to be emanating from the bridge itself, a low rhythmic pulsing that was barely audible over my engine, but unmistakably organic in nature. The Dead Man's Frequency, from Jake Morrison. The CB radio crackled to life at exactly 3:17 a.m., cutting through the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine like a knife through silk. I'd been hauling freight along Interstate 80 through Nevada for the better part of 15 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd heard every possible transmission that could come through those speakers. Truckers complaining about DOT inspections, dispatchers barking orders, the occasional lonely soul looking for conversation to pass the endless miles of asphalt and sagebrush. But this voice, this transmission, was something altogether different. The voice was old, weathered like leather left too long in the sun, carrying the weight of decades spent on America's highways. What made my hands tighten on the steering wheel wasn't the voice itself, but what it was saying. The transmission came through clear as mountain water, despite the fact that my radio dial showed nothing but static on every channel I'd checked just minutes before. Southbound Kenworth. Mile marker 247. Your time comes Tuesday morning. Heart gives out at the Flying J in Winnemucca. Tell your wife Martha you love her while you still can. The voice paused and I could hear what sounded like pages turning, like someone consulting an old logbook. Eastbound Mack truck, Nevada plates hauling furniture. You've got maybe 6 hours before that front tire blows outside of Elko. Won't kill you, but the jackknife's gonna put you in the hospital for 3 months. I found myself reaching for the CB handset, my mouth dry as desert sand. The logical part of my mind insisted this had to be some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe a couple of bored truckers playing games during the long night hours. But something in that voice, something in the absolute certainty with which it delivered these grim predictions, made my stomach clench with an unnamed dread. Before I could key the mic, the voice continued its litany of doom. White Freightliner, mile marker 251, running overweight on a falsified manifest. Dots waiting for you at the Lovelock scales. That's gonna cost you your CDL and 6 months in county. Another pause, more pages turning. Northbound Volvo with the custom paint job. You're clear sailing all the way to Reno. Safe travels. Driver. The night around me seemed to press closer against the windshield as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, broken only by the occasional cluster of lights from some small town or truck stop. Most of the traffic had thinned out to just us night haulers, the hardcore drivers who preferred the cooler temperatures and lighter traffic of the graveyard hours. The voice on the radio seemed to know exactly where each of us was, what we were hauling, and most disturbingly, what fate awaited us down the road. I pressed the talk button, my voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. Breaker, breaker, this is Moondog Express eastbound. Who is this? How do you know all this stuff about folks on the highway? The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. The desert wind picked up, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the asphalt in my headlight beams. Then, just as I was about to try another channel, the voice returned, and this time it seemed to be speaking directly to me. Jake Morrison, driving the blue Peterbilt with the eagle painted on the hood. Been running this route for 15 years, 3 months, and 8 days. Lost your partner Tommy in that pileup outside Reno back in the 09. Still carrying his lucky rabbit's foot in your shirt pocket. The voice paused, and I instinctively touched the small worn object through the fabric of my flannel shirt. Nobody knew about Tommy's rabbit's foot. I'd never told a soul about carrying it all these years. How do you know that? I managed to croak into the handset, my voice barely steady. Who are you? Name's Earl Hutchins, though I reckon that don't mean much to you young fellas anymore. Been watching over this stretch of highway for longer than I care to count. Used to drive this route myself, back when trucks had character instead of computers. Been dead since 1987, but the job ain't finished yet. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I'd heard truckers tell ghost stories before, tales of phantom drivers and haunted highways, but I'd always written them off as road fever and too much coffee. Now, listening to this impossible voice on my radio, those stories didn't seem quite so far-fetched. The thing about death, Earl's voice continued, crackling through the speakers with an otherworldly quality, is that it don't always take you by surprise. Sometimes you get a warning, a chance to set things right before your number gets called. That's what I do now, Jake. I pass along those warnings to whoever's willing to listen. I found myself slowing down, though I couldn't say why. Something about Earl's presence, even transmitted through radio waves, commanded a kind of respect. The highway ahead remained empty except for a pair of taillights in the far distance and the occasional oncoming headlight sweeping past in the opposite lane. You said you've been doing this since 1987, I said into the handset. How many drivers have you warned? Hundreds, Earl replied without hesitation. Maybe thousands by now. Some listen, some don't. The ones who listen usually make it through whatever's coming for them. The ones who don't... His voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the static-filled air. As if summoned by our conversation, more traffic began appearing on the highway. I watched a white Freightliner pass me going the opposite direction, and my heart sank as I remembered Earl's earlier prediction about falsified manifests and DOT inspections. A few minutes later, I spotted a southbound Kenworth that could very well be the one Earl had mentioned, the one whose driver supposedly had until Tuesday morning. "Earl," I said into the radio, "what about me? Do you see something coming for me?" The silence stretched so long I began to think he'd moved on to monitoring other frequencies. The dashboard clock showed 3:34 a.m., and the desert around me seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't identify. Finally, Earl's voice returned, but now it carried a note of confusion that made my blood run cold. "That's the peculiar thing, Jake. I can see the threads of fate for every driver on this highway, clear as road signs in daylight. But when I look for yours, there's nothing there. Just empty space where your future ought to be. In 30 years of doing this job, I ain't never seen anything like it." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. If Earl could predict everyone's fate except mine, what did that mean? Was I already dead? Was I having some kind of hallucination brought on by highway hypnosis and too many energy drinks? I pinched myself hard enough to leave a mark. But the desert, the truck, and Earl's voice on the radio remained stubbornly real. "What does that mean?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "Honestly, son, I wish I knew. Could mean your fate ain't written yet, that you got more choice in what happens next than most folks do. Or it could mean..." He paused again, and I could hear what sounded like whispered consultations with someone else, though I couldn't make out the words. "Could mean what?" I pressed. "Could mean you're like me, Jake. Could mean you're already on the other side of the veil, just ain't realized it yet. Sometimes when death comes sudden and unexpected, the spirit keeps on trucking for a while before it figures out the journey's over." The idea should have terrified me, but instead I felt an odd sense of calm settling over me like a familiar blanket. The highway ahead seemed to shimmer slightly in my headlights, as if I were looking at it through heat waves, though the desert night was cool. I checked my mirrors and was surprised to see that the usual collection of moths and insects that normally swarmed around truck lights at night was completely absent. "How would I know for sure?" I asked Earl, my voice steadier than I felt. "Try calling your dispatcher," he suggested. "Try calling someone who should know where you are tonight." With trembling fingers, I reached for my cell phone and dialed the number for Southwestern Transport's night dispatch. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a recorded message informed me that the number was no longer in service. I tried calling my ex-wife Sarah, then my brother in Phoenix, then the truck stop in Elko, where I'd planned to fuel up. Every call resulted in the same recorded message or endless ringing with no answer. "The Town of Perpetual Showers," from Marcus Chen. The thing about driving cross-country freight is that you learn to read the sky like scripture, and that night the clouds were writing promises they had no intention of keeping. I'd been hauling electronics from Sacramento to Denver when the first drops started hitting my windshield somewhere outside of Reno, each one catching the amber glow of my running lights like tiny amber jewels before dissolving into streaks across the glass. My Peterbilt's wipers began their familiar rhythm, that steady thump sweep that had lulled me through countless storms over the past 15 years of long-haul driving. The radio had been crackling warnings about flash floods and reduced visibility for the better part of an hour, but I'd weathered worse storms than this. Besides, I was making good time and had a delivery window to meet come morning. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, reflecting my headlights in wavering pools that made the asphalt look like it was breathing. Other drivers were pulling over at truck stops and rest areas, their hazard lights blinking like electronic fireflies in the gathering darkness. But I pressed on through the growing deluge. That's when I saw the exit sign for Millfield. Population 2,847, next service is 32 miles. The strange thing was I'd driven this route dozens of times over the years, knew every truck stop and speed trap between here and Colorado, but I couldn't recall ever seeing that particular sign before. The green reflective surface seemed to glow with an unusual intensity in my headlights, and the white lettering appeared almost luminescent against the storm-darkened sky. Something about it nagged at me, like trying to remember a word that sits just on the tip of your tongue. Familiar yet frustratingly elusive. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against my cab roof with increasing intensity, and I could feel the weight of my trailer shifting slightly in the crosswinds that had begun to accompany the storm. The rational part of my mind said to keep driving, to push through to the next major truck stop I knew would have hot coffee and a place to wait out the worst of it. But there was something almost magnetic about that exit, something that seemed to pull my steering wheel gently to the right as I approached the off-ramp. Before I quite realized what I was doing, I found myself taking the exit, my 18 wheels rolling smoothly down the curved ramp toward what I assumed would be another small highway town, with perhaps a gas station and a diner that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The road wound through rolling hills dotted with the dark silhouettes of oak trees, their branches swaying hypnotically in the wind-driven rain. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, revealing wet pavement that reflected my approach like a mirror leading deeper into the night. The first buildings of Millfield appeared gradually, emerging from the rain-soaked darkness like photographs developing in slow motion. There was something oddly timeless about the architecture, as if the town had been frozen in some indeterminate period between the 1940s and 60s. Neat rows of houses lined streets that curved gently between mature trees, their windows glowing with warm yellow light that seemed to pulse gently in rhythm with the rainfall. Even through the storm, I could see that every lawn was perfectly manicured, every sidewalk clean and unblemished by time or weather. The main street opened before me like a scene from an old movie, complete with diagonal parking spaces occupied by cars that looked freshly washed, despite the ongoing downpour. Neon signs flickered invitingly from storefronts advertising a pharmacy, a five and dime, a barber shop with the traditional red and white poles spinning slowly behind rain-streaked glass. Everything seemed to glow with an inner light that made the colors more vivid than they had any right to be in such weather, as if someone had turned up the saturation on reality itself. I spotted a diner about halfway down the main drag, its neon sign reading May's All-Night Restaurant in cheerful pink cursive letters. The parking lot looked large enough to accommodate my rig, and I could see people moving around inside through windows that glowed like beacons in the storm. I maneuvered my truck into the lot, the air brakes hissing their relief as I came to a stop near the back where I wouldn't block anyone's view. The rain continued its steady percussion against my windshield as I sat for a moment, engine idling, taking in this unexpected oasis of normalcy. Walking from my truck to the diner's entrance, I noticed how the rain seemed to make everything more vivid rather than washing it out. The neon signs reflected in puddles that looked deep enough to hold entire worlds, and the wet pavement gleamed like polished obsidian. The air smelled of rain and growing things, with undertones of coffee and bacon that made my stomach growl in anticipation. A bell chimed cheerfully as I pushed through the diner's glass door, and the warmth inside embraced me like an old friend's welcome. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town diner, complete with red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome stools, and a display case filled with pies that looked like they'd been photographed for a magazine spread. The black and white checkered floor gleamed under fluorescent lights that seemed warmer and less harsh than usual, casting everything in a gentle glow that made the whole place feel like a haven from the storm outside. About half the seats were occupied by people who looked up and nodded pleasantly as I entered, their faces friendly and welcoming. I took a seat at the counter, and within moments a waitress appeared with a steaming cup of coffee and a smile that seemed genuinely warm. She was perhaps 45, with graying hair pinned up neatly and wearing a uniform that looked like it had been pressed within the hour. Her name tag read Dorothy in flowing script, and there was something almost maternal about the way she set the coffee before me and asked if I'd like to see a menu. The coffee was perfect, rich and strong without being bitter, exactly the kind of brew that makes a long night of driving bearable. As I sat there warming my hands around the ceramic mug, I began to notice small details that seemed slightly off. though nothing I could quite put my finger on. The other customers in the diner carried on quiet conversations, but I couldn't quite make out what they were saying, as if their words were being absorbed by the air itself before reaching my ears. The music playing softly from speakers I couldn't locate seemed familiar yet unidentifiable, like songs I might have heard in childhood but couldn't name. Even the rain against the windows had taken on an almost musical quality, creating a gentle rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the ambient sounds inside. The waitress, Dorothy, refilled my coffee without being asked and mentioned that most folks didn't find their way to Millfield unless the weather was just right. When I asked what she meant by that, she just smiled and said that some places were easier to find when the rain was washing the world clean, making everything look the way it was supposed to look. Her words carried a weight I couldn't quite understand, but something in her tone made me glance toward the windows where the rain continued its steady cascade down the glass. I ordered a piece of apple pie that turned out to be extraordinary, with a flaky crust and filling that tasted like autumn afternoons and childhood memories. While I ate, I found myself studying the other patrons more closely. They seemed pleasant enough, dressed in clothing that could have been from any decade between now and 30 years ago, all of it clean and well-maintained. But there was something about their movements that seemed slightly too fluid, too graceful, as if they were all dancers who had rehearsed these simple actions countless times before. The conversation at the booth behind me caught my attention. Two men discussing road conditions and the best routes to various destinations. But when I tried to focus on their words, they seemed to slip away like water, leaving only the impression of voices without the substance of actual communication. I turned in my seat, intending to join their conversation as travelers often do, but found myself looking at their backs as they continued their discussion in tones that seemed to exist just below the threshold of comprehension. It was then that I noticed the clock on the wall had stopped at 11:47, though I was certain it had been working when I first came in. The second hand quivered slightly as if trying to move forward but unable to break free from that precise moment in time. Dorothy appeared at my elbow again, this time asking if I'd like another slice of pie, her smile unchanged but somehow more intense than before. When I asked about the clock, she glanced at it with the expression of mild surprise and said that time moved differently in Millfield, especially when it was raining. The rain outside seemed to be intensifying, and through the diner's windows I could see that the streetlights had taken on a different quality, their illumination more diffuse and dreamlike than it had been when I arrived. The cars parked along the main street appeared to be exactly where they had been an hour ago. The watcher in the glass. From Marcus. I've been driving long haul for 23 years, and in all that time I thought I'd seen everything the interstate had to offer. Empty stretches of asphalt that seem to swallow headlights whole. Fog so thick it turns the world into a gray ghost of itself. And enough strange encounters at truck stops to fill a book twice over. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on that October night when I was hauling a load of electronics from Denver to Jacksonville. The weather had been perfect when I started the run, crisp autumn air and clear skies that stretched endlessly above the Rocky Mountains. My Peterbilt 379 was running smooth as silk, the engine humming that deep, satisfied rumble that tells you everything's working exactly as it should. I'd been making good time too, planning to reach the eastern edge of Colorado before taking my mandatory rest break. The CB radio chattered occasionally with other drivers sharing road conditions and weather updates, but mostly it was just me, my truck, and the hypnotic rhythm of mile markers flashing past in the darkness. Around 11:30, somewhere between Lyman and Burlington on Highway 40, I noticed something odd in my passenger side mirror. At first I thought it was just road fatigue playing tricks on my eyes, the way shadows can start dancing when you've been staring at asphalt for too many hours straight. But as I glanced at the mirror again, adjusting it slightly to get a better view of the trailer behind me, I could have sworn I saw movement that didn't match the steady flow of the landscape rushing past. The mirror showed exactly what it should have shown, nothing more and nothing less. The length of my 53-foot trailer stretched back into the darkness, its running lights blinking their steady amber rhythm, and beyond that, the empty highway disappearing into the night. No other vehicles were visible for miles in either direction, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of road at this hour. Most sensible people were home in their beds, and even the majority of us long-haul drivers had found places to park for the night. I chalked it up to tired eyes and reached for my thermos of coffee, taking a long sip of the still warm brew while keeping one hand steady on the wheel. The caffeine helped sharpen my focus, and I settled back into the comfortable routine of night driving, watching the broken white lines flow beneath my headlights like a river of paint. The radio had gone quiet, leaving only the steady drone of the engine and the whisper of tires on pavement to keep me company. That's when I saw it again, and this time there was no mistaking what I witnessed. In the passenger mirror, clear as day, an eye blinked back at me. Not my own eye reflected from some impossible angle, not a trick of light from oncoming traffic, but a distinct, unmistakable eye that opened and closed with deliberate, almost leisurely purpose. The pupil was dark and seemed to absorb the light from my running lamps, while the iris appeared to be a deep green, the color of pond water in summer. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I felt my heart rate spike as adrenaline flooded my system. I forced myself to look straight ahead at the road, counting to 10 before glancing back at the mirror. The eye was still there, and as I watched, it blinked again slowly and deliberately, as if it knew I was watching and wanted to make sure I understood this wasn't some hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. I reached up and adjusted the mirror, angling it different ways to see if I could make sense of what I was seeing. Sometimes the eye disappeared entirely, leaving only the normal reflection of my trailer and the empty road behind me. But when I moved the mirror back to its original position, the eye returned, blinking with that same unhurried rhythm, roughly once every 10 or 15 seconds. The rational part of my mind, the part that had kept me safe through more than 2 million miles of driving, tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a reflection from my own eye, somehow bouncing off multiple surfaces inside the cab. Maybe it was a piece of debris stuck to the mirror that looked like an eye when the light hit it just right. Maybe I was more tired than I realized and needed to find a place to rest immediately. But deep down, in that primitive part of the brain that still remembers when humans were prey animals, scanning the darkness for predators, I knew what I was seeing was real, and it was watching me with an intelligence that felt ancient and patient and utterly alien to anything I'd ever encountered. I tried looking in the driver's side mirror to see if the same phenomenon was occurring there, but that mirror showed only the normal view of the road alongside my truck. I checked the rear view mirror that gave me a view through the rear window of my sleeper cab, and it too showed nothing unusual. Only the passenger side mirror held that unblinking watcher, that green eye that seemed to follow my movements even when I shifted in my seat. The next time I glanced at it, the eye was no longer alone. A second eye had appeared beside it, identical in color and size, and both eyes blinked in perfect synchronization, creating an effect that was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. The eyes seemed to be looking directly at me, not just in my general direction, but with the kind of focused attention that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and my palms begin to sweat despite the cool night air. I considered pulling over, but something about the isolated nature of this stretch of highway made that option seem even more dangerous than continuing to drive. There were no truck stops or rest areas for another 40 miles, no towns visible from the interstate, just endless prairie grass swaying in the wind on both sides of the road. If something was truly wrong, if I was experiencing some kind of medical emergency or psychological break, I'd be completely alone and vulnerable, stopped on the shoulder of a deserted highway, So I kept driving, checking the speedometer to make sure I wasn't unconsciously speeding or slowing down, monitoring the engine gauges to confirm everything was still running normally, trying to maintain the routine of professional driving, even as my world tilted into something that belonged more in a nightmare than on a familiar highway I'd traveled dozens of times before. The eyes multiplied slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A third eye appeared, then a fourth, arranged in a rough circle around the original pair. Each new eye blinked independently of the others, creating a chaotic pattern of opening and closing that reminded me somehow of the way stars twinkle in the night sky, random and beautiful and completely beyond human understanding. By the time I passed the exit for Burlington, there were at least a dozen eyes of varying sizes filling the passenger mirror, some large and prominent, others small and half-hidden behind their companions. They ranged in color from that original deep green to amber, brown, and an unsettling pale blue that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Despite their different appearances, they all shared the same quality of focused attention, all watching me with an intensity that made it difficult to concentrate on the road ahead. I found myself checking the mirror compulsively every few seconds, unable to resist the magnetic pull of those watching eyes, even though each glance sent a fresh wave of anxiety through my chest. My breathing became shallow and rapid, and I had to consciously force myself to take deep, steady breaths to avoid hyperventilating. That's when I noticed the trailer beginning to sway slightly behind me, a subtle side-to-side motion that shouldn't have been happening on a straight, level stretch of highway with no crosswind. I checked my speed again, confirmed I wasn't going too fast for conditions, and tightened my grip on the steering wheel to maintain better control. But the swaying continued, and in the passenger mirror, the eyes seemed to blink faster, their rhythm becoming more urgent and excited. The swaying intensified, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of something moving inside the trailer, shifting the load despite the fact that the electronics I was hauling were secured with enough straps and tie-downs to hold them in place through a tornado. The truck bucked slightly as whatever was in the trailer threw its weight from side to side, and I had to fight to keep the rig in my lane as the eyes in the mirror blinked with what looked almost like amusement. Then, in a moment of clarity that cut through my fear like a blade, I realized what I had to do. Without allowing myself time to second-guess the decision, I reached up and flipped the passenger mirror so it faced upward toward the roof of the cab, breaking the line of sight between myself and whatever was watching me through the glass. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The swaying stopped instantly, the trailer settling back into stable tracking behind the truck as if nothing had happened. The sensation of movement from the cargo area disappeared, leaving only the familiar road vibrations and engine noise that were as comforting as a lullaby after the chaos of the previous few minutes. I drove the remaining distance to the truck stop in Goodland, Kansas, without looking at that mirror again, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead and the driver's side mirror, the spinning heart from Marcus. The needle on my fuel gauge had been spinning like a compass in a magnetic storm for the last 40 miles, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to tell me something. Round and round it went, clockwise then counterclockwise, never settling on empty or full or anywhere in between, just spinning in lazy circles while the rest of my dashboard behaved normally. The speedometer held steady at 65. The temperature gauge sat comfortably in the middle, and the oil pressure light remained dark, but that fuel needle danced like it had a mind of its own. I'd been driving this stretch of Interstate 80 through Nebraska for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to frozen foods across the heartland, and my 2019 Kenworth had never given me trouble like this before. She was a reliable machine, all chrome and midnight blue paint with enough miles on her odometer to circle the earth 3 times over. But tonight felt different somehow, like the familiar rhythm of the road had shifted into something I didn't recognize. The rain had started around sunset, a gentle patter that gradually built into a steady drumming against the windshield. My wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic dance, clearing the glass just long enough for me to catch glimpses of the empty highway stretching ahead. The yellow lines disappeared under my headlights and emerged again, an endless conveyor belt pulling me forward through the darkness. Most of the other trucks had pulled off at the last truck stop, their drivers choosing to wait out the weather. But I had a delivery deadline in Denver that couldn't wait. The spinning fuel gauge caught my eye again, making another lazy revolution as I watched. According to my trip computer, I should have had nearly 3/4 of a tank remaining, more than enough to reach the next fuel stop in about 60 miles. But something about that spinning needle made my stomach clench with an inexplicable anxiety, as if it were counting down to something I couldn't understand. Static crackled through my CB radio, the usual chatter of long-haul drivers sharing road conditions and weather reports, replaced by an odd interference that rose and fell like breathing. I adjusted the squelch knob, trying to clear the signal, but the static only grew stronger, punctuated by what sounded almost like whispers just below the threshold of understanding. Eventually, I switched it off entirely, preferring the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic percussion of rain on steel. That's when I noticed the semi-truck in my mirrors. It had appeared gradually, the way distant headlights do on a long, straight highway, growing from pinpricks of light to the unmistakable outline of another big rig. But something about its approach felt wrong, too deliberate somehow, as if it were matching my speed with unusual precision. I eased off the throttle slightly, expecting it to pass, but the truck behind me slowed as well, maintaining that same careful distance. When I accelerated back to my cruising speed, it accelerated too, like a shadow mimicking my every movement. The fuel gauge spun faster now, the needle blurring as it whirled around the dial. I tapped the glass face with my finger, thinking it might be stuck, but the spinning only intensified. My engine continued to run smoothly, no sign of fuel starvation or mechanical distress, yet that needle spun like a dervish, as if powered by some force completely disconnected from the actual fuel system. Through the rain-streaked side mirror, I tried to make out details of the truck behind me, but its headlights were too bright, filling the glass with white glare that made it impossible to see the make or model. The beams had an odd quality to them, not the warm yellow of standard halogen bulbs or even the cool blue-white of modern LEDs, but something in between that seemed to pulse subtly, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that almost matched the spinning of my fuel gauge. I reached for my cell phone, thinking I might call dispatch to report the gauge problem, but the screen showed no signal bars despite being in an area where I usually had decent coverage. The phone felt strangely warm in my hand, and when I looked at it more closely, I noticed that the battery indicator was spinning too, just like my fuel gauge, the little green bar rotating around and around instead of showing the actual charge level. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Whatever was happening here went beyond simple mechanical failure. The truck behind me maintained its precise distance, never gaining or falling back, while my fuel gauge spun faster and faster, the needle now just a blur of motion that seemed to generate its own faint glow in the darkness of the cab. The next exit sign emerged from the rain, announcing a rest area in 2 miles. I'd stopped there before during daylight hours, a simple place with picnic tables and vending machines. Nothing fancy but well-maintained and safe. The idea of pulling off the highway, of putting some distance between myself and whatever was following me, suddenly seemed like the most important thing in the world. But when I activated my turn signal to change lanes, the truck behind me did the same, its own blinker flashing in perfect synchronization with mine. I moved back into the travel lane and it followed suit, maintaining that same eerie precision that made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter. The fuel gauge spun so fast now that it made a faint whirring sound, like a tiny motor running at high speed, and I could swear I felt vibrations through the dashboard. The rest area exit approached on my right, the familiar blue sign with its white symbols promising relief and normalcy. At the last possible moment, I yanked the wheel hard right, taking the exit ramp faster than I should have in the wet conditions. My trailer swayed slightly behind me, and I had to fight to keep everything in line as I decelerated down the ramp. In my mirrors, I watched the other truck's headlights continue straight on the interstate, finally breaking that uncanny formation we'd maintained for the last 20 miles. The rest area was empty, except for a single car parked near the restrooms, its windows dark and streaked with rain. I pulled into a truck parking space at the far end of the lot, killed the engine, and sat in the sudden silence trying to make sense of what had just happened. The fuel gauge needle had stopped spinning the moment I turned off the ignition, settling at exactly 3/4 full, precisely where it should have been according to my calculations. But as I sat there in the darkness, watching the rain streak down my windshield, I began to notice that the car by the restrooms looked familiar. It was a dark sedan, maybe 10 years old, with the same odd headlights that seemed to pulse with that strange in-between color. As I watched, the headlights began to flash in a slow, deliberate pattern. 3 short flashes followed by 3 long ones, then 3 short again. The international distress signal, my hands trembling slightly. I started the engine again, and immediately the fuel gauge resumed its frantic spinning, the needle whirling like a trapped insect. The car's headlights continued their SOS pattern, flashing through the rain with increasing urgency. I put the truck in gear and slowly drove toward the exit, keeping my eyes on the mirrors to see if the car would follow. It didn't move as I pulled back onto the interstate, but in that last glimpse before the rest area disappeared behind me, I could swear I saw someone standing beside the driver's door, a dark figure that seemed to be waving at me to come back. The fuel gauge spun faster as I accelerated onto the highway, and within minutes those familiar headlights appeared in my mirrors again, taking up their precise position behind me as if they'd never left. I drove through the night like that, with the spinning gauge marking time like a mad clock and those strange headlights maintaining their vigil behind me. Every exit I considered, every truck stop that promised sanctuary, brought the same response from my mysterious escort. When I signaled to turn, it signaled too, and something deeper than logic told me that whatever waited at those roadside havens would be far worse than simply driving on. The rain continued until dawn, when it gradually faded to a light mist and then to nothing at all. As the sun rose behind me, painting the Nebraska sky in shades of pink and gold, the headlights in my mirrors grew dimmer and dimmer until they finally disappeared entirely. The fuel gauge gave one last frantic spin and settled into normal operation, showing exactly the fuel level I expected after driving through the night. I made my delivery in Denver on schedule, and the Kenworth ran perfectly for the rest of that trip, and many since. But sometimes, on long stretches of empty highway when the conditions are just right, I still catch myself glancing at that fuel gauge, waiting for it to start spinning again. And sometimes, late at night when the CB is full of static and the road stretches endlessly ahead, I wonder if those headlights are still out there somewhere, patiently waiting for another driver to follow home. The spinning needle never did tell me what it was counting down to, but I have a feeling I don't really want to know. The red mist at mile marker 89, from Jake Sullivan. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the last 40 miles. Nothing but white noise and the occasional ghost transmission bleeding through from some distant frequency. I'd been pushing my Kenworth T680 down Interstate 70 through Colorado for 11 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Denver to Kansas City, and my bladder was screaming for relief. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a soft green in the darkness, reading 2:47 a.m., and the mountain highway stretched endlessly ahead like a black ribbon threaded through the sleeping peaks. That's when I spotted the rest area sign, barely visible through the light drizzle that had started an hour back. Mile marker 89, it read, and underneath in smaller letters, restroom facilities available. The parking area looked deserted as I downshifted and guided my rig off the interstate, the air brakes hissing softly as I came to a stop near the single brick building that housed the facilities. The place had that abandoned feel that truck stops get in the dead hours before dawn, when even the most dedicated night drivers are fighting to stay awake. I sat in the cab for a moment, listening to the tick of my cooling engine and the gentle patter of rain on my windshield. The rest area was illuminated by a handful of sodium lights that cast everything in that sickly yellow glow you find at highway stops across America. A few picnic tables sat empty under the covered pavilion, and beyond that, the restroom building squatted like a concrete bunker against the mountainside. Something about the place felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. Maybe it was how the lights seemed dimmer than they should be, or how the rain seemed to fall differently here, heavier somehow, more deliberate. The urgency in my bladder finally overcame whatever reservations I had about the place, and I grabbed my jacket from behind the seat. The rain was cold against my face as I jogged toward the restroom, my boots splashing through puddles that reflected the yellow light in rippling patterns. The men's room door was one of those heavy metal affairs painted institutional green, the kind that always stick and require more force than you expect. When I finally got it open, a wave of stale air hit me, carrying the familiar scent of industrial disinfectant, mixed with something else I couldn't identify, something almost metallic. The restroom was larger than most highway facilities, with white tile walls that had seen better days and a row of 3 stalls along the back wall. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, though 2 of the tubes were flickering intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the floor. I noticed that the grout between the tiles had a reddish tinge, as if it had been stained by something over the years. Probably just rust from old pipes, I told myself, though the colors seemed too vibrant, too fresh for that explanation. As I stood at the urinal, I became aware of a sound that hadn't been there when I first entered. It was subtle at first, like the whisper of wind through a crack in the wall, but gradually it became more distinct, a soft hissing, almost like steam escaping from a radiator was coming from somewhere behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw what looked like a thin red mist beginning to seep from beneath the door of the middle stall. At first I thought it might be some kind of chemical leak or maybe steam from a broken pipe, but the color was wrong, too deep and dark to be anything mechanical. The mist moved with an intelligence that made my skin crawl, not dispersing randomly like steam or gas would, but flowing in purposeful streams along the floor. It reminded me of how smoke moves in still air, but heavier, more substantial. As I watched, transfixed despite every instinct telling me to leave, the red vapor began to rise, creating tendrils that swayed like seaweed in an invisible current. The metallic smell I'd noticed earlier grew stronger, and I realized it reminded me of the scent that lingers in the air after a nosebleed. I finished my business quickly and turned to leave, but the mist had spread faster than I'd anticipated. Red streamers now drifted across the floor between me and the exit, and as I tried to step around them, I felt a strange tingling sensation wherever the vapor touched my exposed skin. It wasn't painful exactly, more like the feeling you get when your foot falls asleep. A pins and needles sensation that made me want to scratch and pull away at the same time. The fluorescent lights continued their erratic flickering, and in the brief moments of darkness, the red mist seemed to glow with its own internal light. That's when I heard the voice, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. It seemed to come from inside the stall where the mist originated, a whisper that barely rose above the hissing sound of the vapor itself. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakably pleading, desperate in a way that made my chest tighten with sympathetic anxiety. Against every rational thought in my head, I found myself moving closer to the stall, drawn by that plaintive whisper. The red mist swirled around my legs now, and the tingling sensation had spread up to my knees, bringing with it a strange warmth that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. I pushed against the stall door, and it swung inward with a creak that echoed off the tiled walls. Inside, the source of the mist was immediately apparent, though understanding what I was seeing took my brain several long seconds. The toilet itself looked normal enough, standard institutional white porcelain, but the water in the bowl was the deep red color of arterial blood. The mist rose from its surface in steady streams, and as I watched, the liquid seemed to bubble and churn as if something were moving beneath its surface. The pleading whisper was clearer now, and I could make out individual words, a voice asking for help, begging for someone to listen. The voice belonged to a woman, and she sounded young, terrified, and impossibly distant, as if she were calling from the bottom of a very deep well. She kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "Don't let me sink. Please don't let me sink." The red liquid in the bowl began to rise, spilling over the rim and onto the floor, where it immediately transformed into more of the glowing mist. I realized with growing horror that the voice was coming from inside the toilet. From whatever dark space lay beyond that crimson surface, I stumbled backward, my rational mind finally overriding the strange compulsion that had drawn me closer. The mist was rising faster now, filling the restroom with a red fog that made it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small white clouds that were quickly swallowed by the crimson vapor. The woman's voice grew more urgent, more desperate, but I forced myself to turn away and push through the thickening mist toward where I remembered the exit being. The door seemed impossibly far away, and with each step the mist grew thicker, more resistant, as if I were trying to walk through liquid. The tingling sensation had spread to my entire body now, and I felt a strange pulling sensation, as if something were trying to draw me back toward the stall. The pleading voice was joined by others now, a chorus of whispers all begging for help, for someone to pull them up, to not let them sink into whatever dark place they'd found themselves. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices seemed to come from inside my head now, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. My outstretched hand finally found the cold metal of the door handle, and I yanked it open with desperate strength. The cool mountain air hit my face like a blessing, washing away the oppressive atmosphere of the restroom. I stumbled out into the rain, gasping and shaking, and turned back to look at the building I just escaped. From outside, everything appeared normal, just another highway rest stop in the middle of nowhere. No red light leaked from beneath the door, no ominous sounds carried on the wind. If I hadn't felt the lingering tingling sensation on my skin, and tasted the metallic flavor still coating my tongue, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. I ran back to my truck through the rain, my boots splashing through puddles that now seemed to reflect red in the yellow light, though when I looked directly at them they appeared normal. The engine turned over with its familiar rumble, and I pulled back onto the interstate with more haste than was probably safe for a vehicle my size. In my mirrors, I watched the rest area disappear into the darkness behind me, but I could swear I saw a red glow emanating from the restroom windows, pulsing like a slow heartbeat against the night. The light that refuses to sleep, from Marcus. I've been driving 18-wheelers across the American heartland for the better part of 23 years now, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen every peculiar thing the road could throw at a man, from phantom hitchhikers to gas stations that seem to exist only when you're running on fumes. The highways hold their secrets close, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened during that humid August night when I first encountered the cabin that wouldn't let darkness in. The run was supposed to be routine, a straight shot from Memphis to Little Rock with a trailer full of farm equipment, the kind of cargo that doesn't complain about bumpy roads or delayed schedules. My Peterbilt 379, a deep blue beauty I'd christened Big Betty, was purring like a contented cat as we rolled through the Arkansas countryside. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m., and outside my windshield the world had settled into that peculiar stillness that only deep night can bring. No other headlights pierced the darkness ahead or behind, just the steady rhythm of Betty's diesel engine and the soft whisper of tires on asphalt. That's when I first spotted it through the tree line, a warm, golden glow emanating from what appeared to be a small cabin nestled maybe 50 yards back from the highway. At first glance, it seemed perfectly ordinary, the kind of modest hunting lodge or weekend retreat that dotted this part of Arkansas like scattered coins. The light spilling from its windows had that honey-colored quality you get from old incandescent bulbs, the kind that seemed to wrap everything in a comfortable, homey embrace. It was the sort of sight that would normally bring a small smile to a trucker's face, a reminder that somewhere in this vast darkness, people were living their quiet lives. But something about that light nagged at me as Betty's headlights swept past the turnoff. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or perhaps the way the illumination seemed almost too perfect, too uniform, as if every window in the place was lit with the exact same intensity. I found myself checking my mirrors, watching the glow shrink and disappear behind the Arkansas pines, and feeling an odd reluctance to let it go. The sensible part of my mind chalked it up to the late hour and too much truck stop coffee, but the feeling lingered like smoke from a distant campfire. 3 weeks later, I found myself on the same route with another load, this time heading north with a trailer full of bottled water, destined for a distribution center in Memphis. The night was clearer this time, with a sliver of moon hanging like a curved blade in the star-scattered sky. As I approached that familiar stretch of highway, I caught myself slowing slightly, my eyes already searching the tree line for that golden glow. And there it was, exactly as I'd remembered it, that warm, welcoming light spilling from every window of the small cabin, as if whoever lived there was hosting the world's most well-lit gathering. This time, curiosity got the better of caution. I downshifted Betty and pulled onto the shoulder, her air brakes releasing with a satisfied hiss that seemed unnaturally loud in the midnight stillness. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel drive that wound between towering pines, their needles whispering secrets to the gentle night breeze. From my elevated position in the cab, I had a clear view of the structure, and what I saw made me reach for the thermos of coffee with slightly unsteady hands. Every single window blazed with that same honey-colored light, casting geometric patterns across the surrounding grass and illuminating the trunks of nearby trees with an almost theatrical intensity. But here's what struck me as peculiar. There was no variation in the brightness, no flicker or movement that would suggest people moving around inside. The light was constant, unwavering, as if someone had simply turned on every lamp and fixture in the place and then vanished. No shadows passed by the windows, no television's blue glow mixed with the warmer tones, nothing to indicate any kind of human presence despite the obvious signs of habitation. I sat there for perhaps 10 minutes, engine idling, watching and waiting for some sign of life. A dog barked somewhere in the distance and an owl called from the darkness beyond the cabin, but the building itself remained perfectly, unnaturally still. Eventually, the practical demands of my schedule won out over curiosity, and I pulled back onto the highway. But the image of that unchanging light stayed with me like an unfinished song. Over the next several months, that route became something of a regular run for me, and each time I passed the cabin it was the same story. No matter what time I rolled through, whether it was the deepest part of night or those gray hours just before dawn, that building blazed with the same consistent golden illumination. I began to time my passes deliberately, sometimes taking breaks at a truck stop 40 miles back just so I could approach the cabin at different hours. The result was always identical, every window glowing with that warm, inviting light that seemed to mock the very concept of electricity bills or family bedtimes. The obsession, and I suppose that's what it was becoming, reached its peak on a rainy October night when I was hauling a load of paper products to a printing company in Little Rock. The weather was miserable, with sheets of cold rain drumming against Betty's windshield and turning the highway into a river of reflected headlights and brake lights. Visibility was poor enough that I'd dropped my speed to 45 and turned on my hazard flashers, joining a slow-moving procession of vehicles all fighting the same battle against the Arkansas weather. When I reached the familiar stretch of highway, I was driving slow enough to get a really good look at the cabin, and what I saw in the rain-washed darkness made me pull over despite the dangerous conditions. The building was lit up exactly as always, but now I could see details that had been hidden during my previous, quicker passes. The warm light revealed a wraparound porch with several rocking chairs arranged in a neat line, their surfaces dry despite the lack of any visible roof coverage. More disturbing still, I could make out what appeared to be a figure in one of those chairs, motionless facing the highway, perfectly illuminated by the light spilling from the windows behind it. My heart began to beat a little faster as I stared through the rain-streaked windshield, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure appeared to be wearing light-colored clothing, possibly a white or cream-colored shirt, and seemed to be of average build, though the distance and weather made it impossible to determine much more. What struck me most forcefully was the complete stillness of the person. No movement to acknowledge the passing traffic, no shift in posture despite what must have been a thoroughly soaking rain, nothing to suggest they were anything more than a very realistic mannequin. But mannequins don't wave. And as I sat there in Big Betty's cab, wipers working overtime against the downpour, the figure slowly raised what appeared to be its right hand in a gesture that could have been a greeting, or perhaps something else entirely. The movement was deliberate and controlled, lasting perhaps 3 or 4 seconds before the hand returned to its previous position. Then, as if that simple gesture had used up its allotted energy, the figure resumed its motionless vigil. That wave, friendly or otherwise, broke whatever spell had been holding me to the shoulder of the highway. I dropped Betty into gear and pulled back onto the roadway, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than the wet conditions alone warranted. In my mirrors, I watched the golden glow of the cabin shrink and disappear, taking with it the image of that impossibly dry figure on the rain-soaked porch. The rest of the drive passed in a blur of anxious mile markers and an overwhelming desire to reach the bright lights and human voices of the Little Rock distribution center. That incident might have been enough to convince most drivers to find alternate routes, but the perverse curiosity that had gotten me into trouble more than once in my life wouldn't let the matter rest. I began asking other truckers about the cabin, describing its location and the perpetual light show, but none of my colleagues seemed to know what I was talking about. Some claimed to run that stretch regularly and insisted there was nothing but empty forest between the mile markers I specified. Others nodded politely and changed the subject, the way people do when they think someone might be losing their grip on reality. The truth, whatever it was, finally revealed itself on a crystal-clear November night, when the first frost of the season had decorated the Arkansas landscape with silver filigree. I was deadheading back to Memphis, running empty after delivering a load of furniture to a warehouse in Little Rock, when I made the decision to stop at the cabin directly. Not just pull over and observe from the highway, but actually walk up that gravel drive and knock on the front door like any normal person seeking directions or assistance. Betty's headlights swept across the gravel as I turned into the drive, illuminating a path that seemed narrower and more overgrown than I'd remembered. The Mirror That Shows Tomorrow, from Jake Morrison. The thing about driving 18-wheelers for 37 years is that you develop habits, reflexes that become as natural as breathing. Check your mirrors every few seconds, scan the gauges, feel the road through the steering wheel. These habits keep you alive on highways where a moment's inattention can turn you and everyone around you into twisted metal and regret. So when my rearview mirror started showing me things that hadn't happened yet, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with the world, or maybe just wrong with me. It started on a Tuesday night in October, somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City, on Interstate 40. The weather had been perfect all day, one of those crisp autumn evenings where the air feels clean, and the stars seem close enough to touch. My Peterbilt 379 was running smooth as silk, The cat engine purring with that deep, satisfied rumble that lets you know all 15 gears are working in harmony. I'd been making good time, no traffic to speak of. Just me and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon. The load I was hauling was nothing special. Just auto parts destined for a warehouse in Tulsa. The trailer was properly balanced. The weight distributed exactly as it should be. Everything felt normal, routine, the kind of run I could do in my sleep after all these years. The CB radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other drivers, talking about weather conditions ahead or complaining about DOT checkpoints. The usual road talk that forms the soundtrack of life out here. I first noticed something odd around 11:30, when I glanced up at my rear-view mirror to check the trailer and saw brake lights that weren't there. Not behind me, you understand, but in the reflection itself. Bright red dots in the darkness where my trailer should have been. I looked over my shoulder through the sleeper cab window and saw nothing but the normal running lights of my trailer, steady and amber in the night. When I looked back at the mirror, everything appeared normal again. Fatigue, I told myself. Road hypnosis. After 3 decades behind the wheel, I knew all about the tricks your mind could play during long hauls. The rhythmic hum of tires on pavement, the steady vibration of the engine, the hypnotic effect of headlights cutting through darkness. It all conspired to make your brain see things that weren't there. I adjusted my position in the driver's seat, rolled down the window a crack to let some cool air wash over my face, and reached for my thermos of coffee. But 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time the mirror showed flashing emergency lights, the red and blue strobes of what looked like police cars or an ambulance. The reflection was crystal clear, so vivid I could make out individual light patterns. My heart rate kicked up a notch as I checked my actual mirrors and looked behind me. Nothing. The highway stretched empty in both directions, just the occasional distant glow of headlights miles away. I grabbed the CB handset and keyed the mic. Breaker 19, this is Big Jake eastbound on 40 at mile marker 215. Anyone got eyes on any smokies or emergency vehicles in this area? The radio crackled for a moment before a voice responded. Negative, Big Jake. Road's been clear as glass for the past hour. You got some kind of problem there, driver? No problem, I replied, though my voice sounded uncertain even to myself. Just thought I saw some lights. Thanks for the comeback. I hung up the mic and tried to focus on driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, like the atmospheric pressure drop you feel before a severe thunderstorm. The next few miles passed without incident, and I started to relax again. The coffee was helping, the caffeine clearing away whatever cobwebs had been clouding my perception. I cranked up the radio, found a late-night talk show discussing UFO sightings in New Mexico, and let the familiar rhythm of the road work its magic. The speedometer held steady at 67 miles per hour, just fast enough to make good time without attracting attention from highway patrol. Then, at mile marker 243, everything changed. I glanced up at the rear-view mirror and saw myself. Not my current self, but me from about 15 minutes in the future. I could tell because the dashboard clock in the reflection showed 12:17 a.m., while my actual clock read 12:02. The future Jake in the mirror looked panicked, his face pale and drawn, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. His mouth was moving like he was shouting something, but I couldn't hear any sound. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the Peterbilt to a controlled stop on the shoulder. The air brakes hissed like angry serpents as the truck settled. My hands were shaking as I reached up to adjust the mirror, tilting it this way and that, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The reflection followed my movements perfectly, but it was still showing that terrified version of myself from the future, still displaying that impossible timestamp. This wasn't fatigue or road hypnosis. This was something else entirely. Something that violated every natural law I understood. I'd heard stories from other drivers over the years. tales of strange encounters on lonely highways. But I'd always filed them away as elaborate fiction or the products of too much time alone on the road. Now faced with evidence that reality might be more flexible than I'd believed, I felt a cold dread settling in my chest like a stone. I pulled out my cell phone, thinking I might call my dispatcher or maybe even 911. But what would I say? That my mirror was showing the future? They'd have me pulled off the road for a psychological evaluation before I could finish explaining. Instead, I sat there in the cab, engine idling, trying to work up the courage to look in the mirror again. When I finally did, the reflection had changed. Now it showed my truck from an external perspective, as if I were watching security camera footage. I could see my Peterbilt from above and behind, sitting on the shoulder exactly where I was parked. But in the reflection, there was another vehicle approaching fast from behind. Too fast. A sedan that seemed to be drifting into the shoulder lane. The timestamp in the corner of this impossible view read 12:19 a.m. Understanding hit me like a physical blow. The mirror wasn't just showing the future, it was showing me a future where something terrible was about to happen. I looked at my dashboard clock, 12:16 a.m. I had 3 minutes to figure out what to do. My training kicked in. I turned on my emergency flashers, activated my clearance lights, and checked my mirrors, my normal mirrors, for any sign of approaching traffic. The highway behind me was dark, but I could see a faint glow in the distance that might have been headlights. I started the truck and prepared to pull back onto the highway, thinking I could simply drive away from whatever was coming. But when I looked in the rearview mirror again, the scene had updated. Now it showed the same sedan, but it had followed me back onto the highway and was approaching even faster, weaving slightly as if the driver was impaired or distracted. The timestamp read 12:21 a.m. No matter what I did, this collision seemed destined to happen. I grabbed the CB again. Mayday, mayday, this is Big Jake eastbound on Interstate 40 approaching mile marker 245. I've got a possible impaired driver approaching fast from behind. Anyone in the area, please be advised, we might have a situation developing here. Several voices responded. Other truckers who could relay the information or watch for the incident, but none of them were close enough to help directly. The clock on my dashboard clicked over to 12:18 a.m. According to the mirror's predictions, I had 1 minute before impact. I could see actual headlights behind me now, approaching much faster than the speed limit would allow. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the Peterbilt up to 75 miles per hour, hoping to stay ahead of whatever was coming, but the headlights kept gaining. In my side mirror, my normal, non-prophetic side mirror, I could see a dark sedan weaving between lanes, sometimes drifting onto the shoulder, sometimes crossing the center line. The driver had to be asleep or drunk or both. At 12:19 a.m. exactly, just as the rear-view mirror had predicted, the sedan pulled alongside my trailer, matching my speed but continuing to weave erratically. I laid on the air horn, 3 long blasts that echoed across the prairie, hoping to wake up whoever was behind the wheel. The sedan swerved away from my truck but then began to drift back as if drawn by some magnetic force. I could see the driver now, a young woman whose head kept nodding forward. She was fighting sleep and losing. The prophetic mirror updated again, showing me a scene from 12:23 a.m. The sedan had veered completely off the road and rolled over in the median, and I could see emergency vehicles racing toward the scene. The loop at mile marker 237 from Jake Morrison. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of an hour when I first spotted the green sign reflecting in my headlights. Interstate 84 stretched endlessly ahead of my Peterbilt, the familiar weight of 20 tons of freight behind me, creating that steady, hypnotic rhythm that every long-haul driver knows by heart. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a steady 11:47 p.m., and my logbook reminded me that I had maybe 3 hours left before I'd need to find a place to rest. The October rain had been my constant companion since leaving Portland, drumming against the windshield in a pattern that seemed almost musical, punctuated by the rhythmic sweep of my wipers cutting through the darkness. Rest area, 2 miles. The sign announced in that standard reflective lettering that had guided countless weary travelers off the interstate for a moment of respite. I'd been driving this route for nearly 15 years, but something about that particular sign struck me as unfamiliar, though I couldn't quite place why. The rain intensified as I downshifted, the engine's deep rumble changing pitch as I prepared to exit the main highway. My headlights swept across the off-ramp, illuminating the wet asphalt that seemed to gleam like black glass beneath the storm. The rest area appeared gradually through the curtain of rain, a collection of dim sodium lights casting sickly yellow pools across empty parking spaces. It was larger than I'd expected, with separate sections for automobiles and commercial vehicles, though at this hour it was completely deserted. The facility building sat in the center like a small fortress, its windows glowing with that harsh fluorescent light that makes everything look slightly surreal at night. I guided my rig into the truck parking area, the air brakes hissing as I came to a stop near what appeared to be the only other vehicle present, a dark sedan parked at an odd angle near the restrooms, its occupant nowhere to be seen. The silence that greeted me when I shut off the engine was profound, broken only by the steady patter of rain on the cab roof and the occasional tick of cooling metal. I'd planned to grab a coffee from the vending machines and maybe stretch my legs for 20 minutes before continuing on toward Boise, but something about the atmosphere made me hesitate. The building's lights flickered intermittently, creating brief moments of near darkness that seemed to swallow the surrounding landscape entirely. During those flickers, I caught glimpses of something that didn't quite make sense. The parking lot seemed to extend much further into the darkness than it should have, as if the rest area was far larger than what the lights revealed. I pulled on my jacket and stepped down from the cab, immediately feeling the cold October air cut through the humid warmth that had built up during the drive. The rain was lighter than it had sounded from inside the truck, more of a persistent mist that clung to everything and made the asphalt treacherous underfoot. As I walked toward the building, my footsteps echoed strangely in the empty space, each sound seeming to stretch and multiply, until it became difficult to determine which echoes were coming from my own movement and which seemed to originate from elsewhere. In the darkness beyond the lights, the vending machines hummed with electrical life, their displays advertising coffee and snacks in colors that seemed too bright for the dreary surroundings. I fed quarters into the coffee machine, listening to the mechanical grinding and gurgling as it prepared what would undoubtedly be terrible coffee, but coffee nonetheless. While I waited, I glanced toward the restroom area and noticed that the dark sedan I'd seen earlier was no longer in the same position. In fact, I couldn't see it at all from where I stood, though I was certain it had been parked just outside the building when I'd arrived. The coffee was indeed terrible, but it was hot and caffeinated, which was all that really mattered. I stood under the covered walkway protected from the rain and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me since arriving. Rest areas at night were always somewhat eerie, filled with the transient energy of travelers passing through, but this place felt different somehow. The silence was too complete, the darkness beyond the lights too absolute, and there was something about the way sound behaved here that made every small noise feel significant and somehow wrong. It was when I turned to head back to my truck that I first noticed the problem with the entrance road. From where I stood, I could see the path I had taken into the rest area, but it didn't lead back to what looked like an on-ramp. Instead, the road seemed to curve away into darkness, disappearing between trees that I didn't remember seeing when I'd arrived. I walked closer to get a better view, but the rain and poor lighting made it difficult to make out exactly where the entrance road went. What I could see clearly was that there was no visible connection back to the interstate, no lights from passing traffic, no sound of vehicles moving at highway speeds. My uneasiness deepened as I made my way back toward the truck parking area, and that's when I discovered that the dark sedan had returned, or perhaps had never left at all. It sat in exactly the same position I'd first observed, parked at that peculiar angle near the restrooms. The windows were fogged with condensation, making it impossible to see inside, but there was definitely someone behind the wheel. A dark silhouette that remained perfectly still despite my presence. I called out a greeting, thinking perhaps the driver needed assistance, but received no response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my voice, just sat there in the driver's seat like a statue. Back at my Peterbilt, I climbed into the cab and tried to make sense of what I was experiencing. I pulled out the atlas from my glove compartment and studied the section covering Interstate 84 through this part of Oregon. According to the map, there should have been several rest areas along this stretch of highway, but none were marked at the location where I believed myself to be. I checked my GPS system, but it showed only a blank screen with a message indicating that satellite signal had been lost. Even more disturbing, my CB radio produced nothing but static on all channels, including the emergency frequencies that should have had some activity even at this late hour. I decided to leave immediately and started the engine, but as I began to pull forward, my headlights illuminated something that made me hit the brakes harder than I intended. The road leading out of the rest area, the same road I had used to enter, ended abruptly in what appeared to be a concrete barrier about 50 feet from where the pavement began. Beyond the barrier, there was nothing but forest, dark trees standing like sentinels in the rain. I backed up and tried a different direction, following what seemed to be another exit road, but it led to the same impossible dead end. The realization that I was trapped came slowly, my rational mind fighting against what my eyes were clearly showing me. I drove carefully around the entire perimeter of the rest area, my headlights cutting through the darkness, revealing the same pattern again and again. Every road that should have led back to the interstate simply ended in barriers or dense forest, as if the rest area had been surgically removed from the highway system and placed in some isolated pocket of space where normal geography no longer applied. During my exploration of the facility's boundaries, I passed the dark sedan multiple times, and each time the motionless figure behind the wheel seemed to track my movement without ever turning its head. The building's lights continued their irregular flickering, and during the moments of darkness, I began to notice other vehicles in the parking areas, cars and trucks that hadn't been there moments before, all with those same still silhouettes behind their windshields. When the lights returned, most of these vehicles would vanish, but a few would remain, adding to a growing collection of trapped travelers. As the night wore on, I tried everything I could think of to escape. I attempted to drive through the forest, but my truck couldn't navigate between the closely spaced trees, and I was afraid of becoming stuck or damaging the rig. I walked the perimeter on foot, searching for any path that might lead back to civilization, but found only more trees and more darkness. The rain continued its steady rhythm, and the temperature dropped steadily, making the cab of my truck the only truly warm place in this strange, isolated world. It was nearly dawn when I finally discovered what might have been an exit. While exploring the darkest corner of the rest area, far from the building and its flickering lights, I found a narrow gap between two concrete barriers that I had somehow missed during my earlier searches. The opening was barely wide enough for my truck, and I couldn't see where it led, but it was the first potential escape route I'd encountered. I backed my Peterbilt up to get a good approach angle, said a quiet prayer to whatever forces governed the roads, and accelerated toward the gap. The concrete scraped against both sides of my trailer as I squeezed through the opening, and for a terrifying moment I thought I might become wedged permanently between the barriers. Channel 19, the frequency between worlds. from Marcus. Big Iron. Rodriguez. The thing about driving the long haul for 37 years is that you think you've seen everything the interstate has to offer. Every truck stop diner with its burned coffee and conversations that loop like broken records. Every stretch of lonely asphalt that cuts through America's forgotten places. Every static-filled voice that crackles through your CB radio at 3 in the morning, when the world feels thin and strange. But I was wrong about having seen it all, and I learned that lesson on a rain-soaked Tuesday night somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, when I stumbled onto a frequency that wasn't meant for truckers like me. The storm had been building all evening, one of those desert tempests that comes out of nowhere and turns the sky into a churning mass of purple-black clouds. My Peterbilt's windshield wipers were working overtime, their rhythmic squeaking mixing with the steady drum of rain on the cab roof and the low rumble of my diesel engine as I pushed through the darkness. The CB radio had been mostly quiet, just the occasional weather update or complaint about the visibility. When I decided to scan through the channels looking for something to keep me company through the worst of it, I'd worked my way up from Channel 1, catching fragments of conversation here and there. When I hit Channel 19 and heard something that made me ease off the throttle, the voice was clear as crystal despite the storm. A woman speaking in measured tones about coordinates and intersections, but not the kind you'd find on any map. She was talking about places where highways crossed over into somewhere else, about rest stops that only appeared under certain conditions, about truck routes that led to destinations that didn't exist in our world. At first, I thought it might be some kind of role-playing game or maybe a trucker with too much imagination and too much time on his hands. But there was something in her voice, a quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She spoke with the authority of someone who had been to these places, who had seen things that most people couldn't even dream of. And as I listened, other voices began to join the conversation. Drivers with call signs I'd never heard before, discussing cargo manifests for shipments that defied logic and delivery schedules that seemed to operate outside of normal time. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the world beyond my headlights into a wall of silver droplets that caught and scattered the light. I had to slow down to 40 miles per hour just to stay on the road, and that's when I heard my call sign come through the radio. "Big Iron," the woman's voice said, and I felt my blood turn cold because I hadn't transmitted anything, hadn't identified myself on this channel. "Big Iron, you've been listening long enough. Time to make a choice." I reached for the microphone with a hand that wasn't quite steady, thumb hovering over the talk button as I tried to decide whether to respond or just change channels and pretend I'd never heard any of this. But something made me press that button. Some combination of curiosity and the hypnotic quality of her voice. "This is Big Iron," I said. "How did you know my handle?" Her laugh was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, beautiful and somehow deeply unsettling. "We know all the drivers who find their way to our frequency," she said. "The question is whether you're ready to drive for us. We have routes that go everywhere and nowhere. Cargo that exists in the spaces between seconds and destinations that most people never dream of reaching. All you have to do is take the next exit and follow our directions." I looked ahead through the rain and saw something that shouldn't have been there. An exit sign glowing with soft blue light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The sign didn't have a number or destination name, just an arrow pointing into darkness that seemed deeper than the storm could account for. Every instinct I developed over 3 decades of driving told me to keep going, to ignore the exit and the voice and get back to the familiar world of delivery schedules and way stations. But there was something else pulling at me, a curiosity that had been growing stronger with each mile I'd driven over the years. How many times had I wondered what lay beyond the edges of the map? What kinds of places existed in the spaces between the towns and cities I knew so well? How many nights had I stared out at the desert or the plains and felt like I was missing something important, some secret that the road was trying to tell me? I slowed down as I approached the exit, my turn signal clicking steadily as I tried to make up my mind. The woman's voice came through the radio again, softer now, almost intimate. "The gate is only open for a few more minutes," she said. "After that, you'll have to wait for the next storm, the next alignment, and there's no guarantee you'll find us again." The exit ramp curved away into darkness that my headlights couldn't penetrate, and as I started down it, I felt the familiar vibration of my truck's engine change subtly, as if the very air had become thicker, more resistant. The sound of the rain on my windshield faded, replaced by something that might have been music or might have been the whisper of wind through structures that didn't belong in the Arizona desert. My headlights began to reveal glimpses of the impossible as I descended the ramp. There were other vehicles ahead of me, trucks of makes and models I didn't recognize, their running lights casting patterns and colors that seemed to shift and change as I watched. The road surface beneath my tires felt different too, smoother than asphalt but with a subtle give that reminded me of driving on packed earth, though I could see it gleaming like metal in my headlights. The CB radio crackled with new voices now, drivers calling out coordinates and cargo descriptions that made no sense in the world I knew. Someone was hauling a load of crystallized starlight to a depot that existed only during leap years. Another driver was complaining about a delivery of bottled dreams that had started leaking and was making his trailer smell like childhood summers. A third voice was asking for directions to a truck stop that served meals you could taste in your sleep for the rest of your life. I wanted to join their conversations, to ask 1,000 questions about this world I was entering, but something held me back. Maybe it was the last vestige of caution, or maybe it was the growing realization that I might be crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross. The road ahead was opening up into what looked like a vast truck depot, with loading docks that stretched up into a sky filled with stars in patterns I'd never seen before. The air shimmered with heat mirages that moved against the laws of physics, and I could see drivers walking between the bays, their movements just slightly too fluid, too graceful for ordinary humans. That's when the fear finally cut through my fascination, sharp and cold as a knife blade. These weren't just unusual routes or exotic cargo. This was something fundamentally different. A place that operated by rules I didn't understand and might not survive learning. I pressed the brake pedal and felt my truck shudder as it fought against forces that wanted to pull me deeper into this otherworldly depot. The woman's voice came through the radio one more time, and now I could hear something predatory underneath the silk-smooth tones. "Too late to change your mind now, Big Iron," she said. "The gate only opens one way during a crossing. You'll have to make your first delivery before you can think about going home." But I'd been driving trucks since before GPS systems and electronic logs, back when knowing your rig and trusting your instincts were the only things standing between you and disaster. I yanked the wheel hard to the left and punched the accelerator, feeling my trailer swing wide as I executed a jackknife turn that would have impressed my driving instructor if it didn't give him a heart attack. My headlights swept across loading bays filled with cargo containers that seemed to be made of crystallized shadow and dock, workers whose faces were hidden beneath hoods that moved like living things. The turn carried me onto what looked like an on-ramp, though the surface was still that strange metal-smooth material, and the guardrails were made of something that pulsed with its own inner light. I could hear voices shouting through the CB radio now, angry voices demanding that I return to the depot, but I kept my foot on the accelerator and my eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. The transition back was like being pulled through thick liquid, a sensation of pressure and resistance that made my ears pop and my vision blur. Then suddenly I was back on familiar asphalt, with ordinary rain drumming on my windshield and the comforting glow of interstate markers appearing in my headlights. I looked in my mirrors and saw nothing but empty highway behind me, as if the exit and the depot had never existed at all. I drove for another hour before I trusted myself to stop at a truck stop, and when I did, I sat in my cab with a cup of coffee and tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. The motel where silence bleeds, from Marcus. The CB radio crackled with static as I pulled into the gravel lot of the Restful Inn, somewhere deep in the Nevada desert, where the highway stretched like a black ribbon between endless sagebrush and distant mountains. After 18 hours behind the wheel of my Peterbilt, hauling electronics from Los Angeles to Denver, my eyes felt like sandpaper, and my spine ached with every pothole memory from the last 300 miles. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed 2:47 a.m., and the motel's neon sign buzzed and flickered against the star-drunk sky, casting everything in alternating shades of pink and darkness. The place looked like it had been transplanted from 1962 and forgotten by time, with its low-slung adobe units arranged in an L shape around a kidney-shaped swimming pool that reflected the moon like a dead eye. A few cars sat scattered in the lot, their chrome bumpers and tail fins catching the neon glow, and I remember thinking how strange it was to see so many classic vehicles in one place, all of them immaculate despite the desert dust that seemed to coat everything else for miles around. The office door chimed with an actual bell as I stepped inside, breathing in the scent of old carpet and something floral that might have been air freshener, or might have been the ghost of 1,000 checkout bouquets. Behind the counter stood a thin man with silver hair slicked back and a smile that belonged in a dentist's advertisement. Wearing a burgundy vest over a white shirt that looked freshly pressed despite the late hour, his name tag read Earl in faded gold letters. "Welcome to the Restful Inn, friend," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "You look like a man who could use some quality sleep." The way he emphasized the word quality made something in my chest flutter, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was just the exhaustion playing tricks with my nerves. The way overnight drives sometimes made shadows dance at the edge of your vision and turned radio static into whispered conversations. I paid cash for a room, Unit 17, and Earl handed me a heavy brass key attached to a plastic diamond that caught the overhead light like a prism. "Sweet dreams," he said. And again there was something in his tone that sat wrong, like a song played in a minor key when you expected major. But the bed was calling to me through the thin walls, and I was too tired to puzzle over a desk clerk's peculiar mannerisms. Unit 17 sat near the end of the row, with a perfect view of my truck parked under a flickering streetlight that cast dancing shadows across the trailer's aluminum sides. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and old tobacco, with turquoise walls and a painting of a desert sunset that seemed to watch me as I dropped my duffel bag on the dresser. The bed looked inviting enough, with its geometric bedspread and stacked pillows, and the air conditioning unit hummed a steady rhythm that promised to drown out any highway noise. But as I settled onto the mattress, still wearing my jeans and flannel shirt because undressing felt like too much effort, I began to notice the sounds, not the usual motel symphony of ice machines and distant televisions, but something else entirely. From the room next door, Unit 16, came a soft scratching sound like fingernails drawn slowly across wood or plaster. It stopped after a few seconds, then started again, following a rhythm that reminded me of Morse code, though I couldn't decipher any meaning in its pattern. I closed my eyes and tried to let the air conditioner's white noise carry me towards sleep. But the scratching continued, joined now by what sounded like whispered counting. 7, 8, 9. The voice was so faint I couldn't tell if it belonged to a man or woman, child or adult. It simply drifted through the walls like smoke, methodical and endless. 14, 15, 16. Sleep came anyway, the way it does for drivers who've learned to rest whenever opportunity allows, regardless of circumstances. But it was the kind of shallow sleep that leaves you aware of your surroundings, floating just beneath consciousness while your body recharges and your mind processes the day's accumulated miles. In this twilight state, I became aware that other sounds had joined the scratching and counting. Footsteps in the gravel outside moved back and forth past my window, always the same measured pace, never stopping or changing direction. A door opened and closed somewhere nearby, followed by the sound of running water that went on far too long to be normal use. Then came the screaming. It started low and distant, like wind through a canyon, but gradually grew closer and more distinct. Not the scream of pain or sudden fear, but something worse. The sound of absolute despair given voice, rising and falling in waves that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. The screaming came from multiple directions, as if the entire motel had erupted in synchronized anguish, yet somehow muffled, as though the voices were trapped behind glass or buried underground. I sat up in bed, fully awake now, my truck driver instincts telling me to assess the situation and prepare for whatever might come next, but the screaming had stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving only the familiar hum of the air conditioner and the distant whisper of highway traffic. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see my Peterbilt sitting exactly where I'd left it, its chrome bumper gleaming under the streetlight like a beacon of normalcy in this increasingly strange night. The scratching from next door resumed, more insistent now, joined by new sounds from other rooms, soft sobbing from across the courtyard, the rhythmic creaking of bed springs that went on too long and followed no human pattern. Somewhere, a radio played music that sounded like it was transmitted from another decade, all saxophone and crooning vocals that belonged in a different world entirely. I checked my watch. 3:23 a.m. In 12 hours, I needed to be back on the road, pushing toward Denver with a schedule that allowed no room for delays. But sleep seemed impossible now, with the symphony of strange sounds growing more complex by the minute. I considered getting dressed and returning to my truck, maybe pushing through to the next town, but fatigue weighed on me like a physical thing, making even simple decisions feel monumental. That's when I noticed the photographs. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, I could see that what I'd initially taken for a single desert sunset painting was actually a collection of framed photographs arranged across the wall above the dresser. Black and white images of people sleeping, men, women, children, all captured in peaceful repose with their eyes closed and hands folded across their chests. But as I looked closer, something about the photos disturbed me. The sleeping figures were too still, too perfectly arranged. Their skin had a waxy quality that reminded me of department store mannequins, and their clothes looked vintage, like costumes from a historical reenactment. The scratching from next door had evolved into what sounded like deliberate carving, as if someone was etching words or pictures into the wall that separated our rooms. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster and heard the unmistakable sound of wood being slowly, methodically hollowed out. But when I knocked on the wall, the sound stopped immediately, replaced by absolute silence that felt more ominous than any noise. Outside my window, the footsteps in the gravel had multiplied. Now it sounded like a parade of people walking past, their shoes crunching in perfect unison, though I could see no shadows moving across the courtyard. The swimming pool's surface had gone completely still, no longer reflecting the flickering neon sign, just holding darkness like a mirror turned towards something I couldn't see. I must have dozed again because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the gap in the curtains and my watch read 6:15 a.m. The strange sounds had stopped, replaced by normal morning activities. Car doors slamming, engines starting, the distant clatter of breakfast dishes from what might have been a restaurant or coffee shop. But when I pulled back the curtains to check on my truck, the parking lot was empty except for my Peterbilt. All those classic cars from the night before had vanished without a trace, leaving only oil stains on the gravel to suggest they'd ever been there at all. The photographs above the dresser were gone too, replaced by the simple desert sunset painting I'd initially seen. When I examined the wall that separated my room from Unit 16, I found no evidence of the carved scratching that had kept me awake. Just smooth plaster painted the same turquoise as the rest of the room. At the front desk, Earl was nowhere to be found. Instead, a young woman with tired eyes and coffee-stained uniform processed my checkout, acting as if she'd been there all along. When I asked about the night clerk, She looked confused and told me she'd been working alone since midnight covering for someone who'd called in sick.